The man who could destroy a billion-dollar empire was changing oil filters in a two-bay garage. Nolan Pierce knew exactly which batch of engines would fail. He'd known for 10 years. And tonight, the woman whose company built those engines was parking outside his shop with questions he'd spent a decade preparing to answer. But before we see how one mechanic's filing cabinet brought down an automotive giant, let me ask you this. Have you ever been the only person who knew the truth? Stay until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The fluorescent lights in Pierce Auto Repair flickered the way they always did around 7 p.m. 3 steady pulses, then a buzz that settled into the ambient hum of a Thursday evening in Grayford, Ohio. Nolan Pierce didn't look up from the Chevy Malibu he was working on. The flicker was just another rhythm in the mechanical symphony he'd learned to live inside. The pneumatic hiss of the lift, the tick of cooling metal, the distant bark of Mrs. Chen's terrier 3 properties down. He wiped his hands on a rag that had been gray since 2019 and checked his watch. 7:14. Elsie's mac and cheese was in the oven at home, timer set for 7:45. He had time to finish this oil change and maybe get a look at the transmission that had been making that grinding noise in third gear. The bell above the door chimed. Nolan glanced over his shoulder, expecting Mrs. Patterson coming to ask again about her Honda's squeaky brakes, the one she refused to let him actually fix because her cousin's boyfriend said it was probably just dust. It wasn't Mrs. Patterson. The woman in the doorway wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Nolan's mortgage payment. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she paid someone to make it look that effortless. She was young, early 30s maybe, but she carried herself with the kind of rigid posture that came from too many boardrooms and not enough sleep. Nolan knew who she was before she said a word. He'd seen her face in trade publications. On business news segments he caught while Elsie watched cartoons in the other room. Marin Vale, CEO of Vale Automotive Systems. 30 years old and running a company her grandfather had built from a tool and die shop in Detroit 70 years ago. She was also, if the rumors were true, about 6 weeks away from watching that empire collapse into bankruptcy and federal investigation. "We're closing up," Nolan said, turning back to the Malibu. "You can leave your keys in the drop box. I'll look at it tomorrow." "I'm not here to leave my car." Her voice was clipped, northeastern, expensive. "You're Nolan Pierce. Sign says so on the building. I need to talk to you." Nolan drained the last of the old oil into the pan and reached for the filter wrench. "Phone's on the wall. Office hours are Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. You want an appointment, call Sharon. She handles the schedule." "Sharon is your answering machine." "Sharon's very efficient." Marin Vale didn't move from the doorway. Nolan could feel her watching him work, cataloging, calculating. He'd seen that look before, back when he wore a different kind of clothes and worked in a different kind of building. "Mr. Pierce, I'm not here about your services as a mechanic. Only service I offer. I know who you are." Nolan's hands paused for half a second, then continued unscrewing the filter. Oil dripped dark and thick into the catch pan. "Congratulations. You want a medal? I know you worked for us 12 years ago. I know you were part of the R&D team that developed the VX7 engine platform. That was a long time ago. I know you left the company in 2015. I know you filed 3 separate internal reports about a defect in the cylinder head assembly. And I know," she took a step into the garage, her heels clicking on the concrete, "I know you've been repairing VX7 engines in this garage for the past decade." Nolan set down the wrench and finally looked at her directly. "You drove 3 hours from Detroit to tell me things you already know?" "I drove 3 hours to ask if you kept records." The fluorescent lights flickered again. Somewhere in the back office, the space heater kicked on with a rattle that Nolan kept meaning to fix. "Records of what?" "Don't insult both of us, Mr. Pierce." Marin's jaw was tight. 743 VX7 engines have catastrophically failed in the past 18 months. The NHTSA opened an investigation in January. We've recalled every vehicle. Our stock price has dropped 62% in 3 weeks, and every single failure matches the exact defect pattern you reported in 2015. Nolan pulled a fresh filter from the shelf and began threading it onto the Malibu's engine block. "Sounds like you have a problem. We have lawsuits in 11 states. We have a federal investigation. We have families who lost loved ones in crashes caused by engines that seized at highway speeds. Her voice cracked slightly on the last part, just a hairline fracture in the professional veneer. And we have lawyers who found your name buried in old company records. The man who warned us this would happen. Then you don't need me. You already know what went wrong. I need to know what you know. I need to know what you documented. Because right now, the picture being painted is that Vail Automotive deliberately ignored safety warnings and continued production, that we knew about the defect and hid it. Nolan lowered the Malibu off the lift and wiped his hands again. Did you? No. But someone did. Marin's silence was its own answer. Nolan walked to the small office at the back of the garage, barely more than a closet with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a calendar from a parts supplier that was 3 years out of date. Elsie's drawing of a purple dinosaur was taped to the wall, the corners curling. He could feel Marin following him, her presence filling the small space like a pressure change before a storm. He unlocked the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. Inside were folders, dozens of them, organized by year, by batch code, by failure type, each one meticulously labeled in Nolan's precise engineer's handwriting. 2015, he said, pulling out a thick folder. First batch of VX7s that came through here. Guy brought in a Traverse, engine seized on I-75. Towed it in, told me it just died. No warning. I pulled the engine apart and found the cylinder head cracked along the same stress line I'd flagged in the design phase. He opened the folder. Inside were photos, printed on regular copy paper, close-ups of metal fractures, measuring tools placed for scale, batch codes stamped into engine blocks. Took photos, documented everything, called it a fluke. He pulled out another folder. 2016, 3 more engines, same failure, same crack pattern, same batch code series. Another folder. 2017, 7 engines. 2018, 14. 2019, 22. The folders stacked up on the desk between them, a growing paper monument to a decade of systematic failure. I kept calling it flukes, Nolan said quietly. Kept thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'd missed something in the original design, made a mistake in the calculations, so I kept fixing them. Kept documenting. Kept waiting for someone at your company to notice the pattern. Marin was staring at the folders like they were evidence at a crime scene. How many total? Through last month? 217 engines. All failures consistent with the defect I reported in 2015. All failures I documented with photos, batch codes, customer statements, and repair notes. Why didn't you come forward? Why didn't you contact someone? Nolan almost laughed. I did come forward 3 times, filed internal reports with engineering, with safety, with your executive team. You know what happened? I got called paranoid. Got told I was seeing patterns that weren't there. Got told the design had been triple-checked and approved by everyone who mattered. He closed the filing cabinet drawer with his boot. Then I got fired for performance issues. Escorted out of the building by security. Had to sign an NDA that said, if I ever talked about proprietary company information, you'd sue me for everything I'd ever own. Who fired you? Your head of operations? Guy named Conrad Sloan. Something shifted in Marin's expression. A muscle tightening in her jaw, a flicker of recognition that she tried to suppress. But Nolan had been reading people's faces across counters and under hoods for a decade. He caught it. You know him, Nolan said. It wasn't a question. He's been with the company for 30 years. He was my grandfather's right hand. He's also the one who buried my reports and pushed the VX7 into production 6 months ahead of schedule. Nolan tapped the folders. I can prove it. Every engine I documented came from batches manufactured in that accelerated timeline, the ones your company rushed out to meet a contract deadline. Marin reached for the top folder, then stopped. Can I? Nolan nodded. She opened it carefully, like it might explode. Her eyes scanned the photos, the notes written in Nolan's tight engineering script. Date, March 14th, 2015. Vehicle, 2014. Chevy Traverse. Mileage, 47,382. Failure. Complete seizure. I-75 northbound, 68 miles per hour. Customer reported no warning lights, no performance issues prior to failure. Engine disassembly reveals. This is exactly what we're seeing now, Marin said. These cracks. this failure sequence. It's identical to the NHTSA reports because it's the same defect. Same metallurgy problem in the cylinder head casting. I told your engineers the alloy mixture wasn't heat treating properly. The crystal structure was developing microfractures during the curing process. Under sustained high heat conditions, highway driving, towing, anything that really pushed the engine, those microfractures would propagate until catastrophic failure. Marin looked up from the folder. You remember all of this? The technical details? I designed that engine, Ms. Vale. I spent 2 years of my life on the VX7 platform. I knew every alloy composition, every tolerance spec, every thermal load calculation. Nolan leaned against the filing cabinet. I also knew it wasn't ready for production when Sloan pushed it through, but I was 28 years old, and he was the guy who'd built half the cars in America. So when he said I was wrong, I figured maybe I was. Until the engines started failing. Until the engines started failing, Nolan agreed. And by then, I was here, raising a kid, running a shop, fixing the problem over and over again because it's what I know how to do. Marin closed the folder and looked around the small office, at the purple dinosaur drawing, at the space heater with its rattling fan, at the man in front of her who'd spent 10 years quietly documenting the collapse of her company's flagship product. What do you want? She asked. Want? For these records, for your testimony. There are lawyers who would pay you a significant amount of money for what's in these folders. Nolan checked his watch. 7:31. Elsie's mac and cheese had 14 minutes left. I don't want your money. Then what? He met her eyes. I want you to tell me the truth. Did you know about the defect? No. The answer came fast, definitive. I took over as CEO 2 years ago when my father stepped down. The VX7 was already in production, already in millions of vehicles. I knew we were having quality issues, but Conrad kept telling me it was normal variation, acceptable failure rates, cost of doing business. And you believed him. I believed the data he showed me. I believed the engineers he put in front of the board. I believed... She stopped. I believed the company my grandfather built wouldn't put profit over safety. Nolan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your grandfather was a good man. Hired me right out of MIT, gave me a chance to work on real projects. He cared about building things that lasted. He died 8 years ago. I know, came to the funeral. Nolan smiled slightly, stood in the back. Didn't think anyone would remember the kid from R&D. Conrad spoke at the service, talked about legacy and standards and everything my grandfather built. Marin's voice was hollow. 3 months later, he was pushing the VX7 into production over your objections. The space heater rattled. The fluorescent lights flickered. These records, Nolan said, gesturing to the folders. They're not going to save your company. You know that, right? This much documentation, this clear a pattern of ignored warnings. Whoever's responsible is going to face criminal charges. There are people dead because of this defect. I know. So why are you here? Why not just let your lawyers subpoena me? Let this all come out in court. Marin was quiet for the long moment. Then she said, Because I want to know the whole truth before it comes out in pieces. Because I want to understand what happened to the company my family built. And because, she looked directly at him, because I read your personnel file. I know you were one of the best engineers we ever had. I know you were loyal to Vale Automotive even after we fired you, and I need to know why you stayed quiet for 10 years. Nolan laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think I stayed quiet? You didn't go to the media. You didn't contact NHTSA. You just fixed engines. I had a 6-month-old daughter and an NDA that would have bankrupted me if I violated it. You think I stayed quiet because I was loyal? Nolan shook his head. I stayed quiet because I was trapped. Because every time I thought about calling a reporter or filing a complaint, I thought about Elsie and what would happen if your company came after me. If I lost this shop. Lost custody because I couldn't provide for her. He picked up the top folder and held it out to Marin. But I never stopped documenting, never stopped keeping records, because I knew someday this would come out. The defect was too fundamental, the failure rate too predictable. It was always going to blow up. I just had to make sure that when it did, there was a record of who knew what and when they knew it. Marin took the folder. So you were building a case. I was protecting my daughter. The case was just insurance. Against what? against men like Conrad Sloan deciding that the mechanic who used to work for them needed to be silenced. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Marin's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and something in her expression shifted. I have to go. I have a board meeting in the morning. They're voting on whether to file bankruptcy or try to negotiate a settlement with the plaintiffs. Which way will they vote? I don't know. Conrad's been pushing for bankruptcy. Says it's the only way to limit liability, protect the company assets. She paused. He's probably right. Nolan walked her to the door. Outside, a black Mercedes was parked in front of the garage. Engine running, driver waiting. The kind of car that cost more than Nolan made in 2 years. Can I take one of these folders? Marin asked. I want my legal team to see what you have. Take them all. I have copies. Of course you do. Nolan gathered the stack of folders and handed them to her. They were heavy. 10 years of evidence, hundreds of hours of documentation, proof of a failure that had been predicted and ignored and covered up. Mr. Pierce, Marin said as she reached the door, if this goes where I think it's going, if there's a criminal investigation, you're going to be subpoenaed. You know that, right? I figured. Your NDA won't protect you once you're under oath. Good. She studied him for a moment. You really don't want anything from this? No settlement? No compensation for what we did to your career? Nolan thought about the purple dinosaur drawing on his office wall. Thought about Elsie's mac and cheese waiting in the oven at home. Thought about 10 years of quiet, steady work in a 2-bay garage in a town where nobody cared what he used to be. I want Conrad Sloan to answer for what he did, Nolan said. I want the families who lost people to know it wasn't their fault. That it wasn't bad luck or bad driving or bad maintenance. I want them to know the truth. And if the truth destroys Vail Automotive, then maybe it should be destroyed. Marin nodded slowly. She walked to the Mercedes, the folders tucked under her arm, and paused with her hand on the door. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For what Conrad did to you. For what the company did. You weren't there. I'm there now. She got in the car and it pulled away, taillights disappearing down Oak Street toward the highway that would take her back to Detroit and boardrooms and the slow-motion collapse of an empire. Nolan stood in the doorway of his garage and watched her go. Then he locked up, turned off the lights, and drove the 6 blocks home to a small house where his daughter was waiting and the oven timer was beeping, and nothing at all had changed, except everything had. Bookchat. Elsie was at the kitchen table doing homework, or what passed for homework in 1st grade, which mostly seemed to involve coloring shapes and practicing writing her name. You're late, she said without looking up from her paper. Mac and cheese is crusty. Sorry, Bug. Had a customer come in right at closing. Mrs. Patterson's breaks again? Different customer. Nolan pulled the casserole dish from the oven. The top was indeed crusty, the cheese darkened around the edges. He scooped 2 servings onto plates and brought them to the table. Elsie looked at her plate critically. The brown parts taste burnt. The brown parts are the best parts. You always say that. Because it's always true. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Outside, the streetlight on the corner flickered on, casting long shadows across the front yard. Mr. Kowalski's sprinkler started up with its familiar clicking rhythm. Dad? Yeah? Maya Rodriguez's mom said you used to work for a big car company, before I was born. Nolan set down his fork. Maya Rodriguez's mom talks a lot. Is it true? Yeah, I worked for Vail Automotive, designed engines. Like the ones you fix now? Some of them. Elsie pushed her mac and cheese around her plate. Why'd you stop? How do you explain to a 6-year-old that you got fired for being right? That you were escorted out of a building by security while your colleagues avoided eye contact? That you spent the next year sending out resumes while your daughter's mother decided she didn't want to be married to an unemployed engineer with a newborn? It was time for something different, Nolan said. Sometimes jobs don't work out. Maya's mom said you got fired. Maya's mom really needs a hobby. Did you? Nolan looked at his daughter. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, too perceptive for someone who still believed in the tooth fairy. Yeah, he said. I got fired. Why? Because I told my boss something he didn't want to hear. What did you tell him? That he was making a mistake, that the engines we were building weren't safe. Elsie considered this. Were you right? Yeah. And he fired you for being right? Sometimes people don't like being told they're wrong, especially when they're the boss and being wrong is expensive. That's dumb, Nolan smiled. Yeah, Bug. It is. They finished dinner. Elsie went to brush her teeth while Nolan cleaned up the kitchen. He was loading the dishwasher when his phone rang. Unknown number, Detroit area code. He let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, it rang again. Same number. On the third call, he answered. Mr. Pierce? A woman's voice, professional, crackling slightly on what sounded like a car phone connection. This is Jessica Chen. I'm an attorney with Morrison & West. Marin Vale asked me to contact you. Kind of late for a legal call. I apologize. Ms. Vale just left an emergency board meeting and asked me to reach out immediately. We need to discuss your documentation of the VX7 failures. Nolan put the phone on speaker and continued loading dishes. Discuss what about them? We need to verify the chain of custody for your records. If these documents are going to be used in litigation, and they will be, we need to establish that they haven't been tampered with, that they are authentic contemporaneous records, and that you maintain them in the normal course of business. I kept them in a filing cabinet, took photos with whatever camera I had at the time, wrote notes on my breaks. That normal enough? Mr. Pierce, I understand this is inconvenient, but... Lady, it's 8:30 on a Thursday night. I've got a first grader in the bathroom who needs to practice her spelling words and a cat that's about to knock over my coffee. So whatever you need to verify, we can do it tomorrow during business hours. There was a pause. Of course. I apologize. Can you come to our Detroit office tomorrow afternoon? No. Monday? I run a business, Ms. Chen. I can't just close up shop and drive to Detroit every time Vale Automotive needs something. We're prepared to compensate you for your time. I don't want compensation. I want to be left alone to do my job. Another pause, longer this time. Then, Mr. Pierce, I'm going to be direct with you. We have reason to believe that certain parties within Vale Automotive may attempt to discredit your testimony or interfere with your records. We need to get ahead of that. What certain parties? I'm not at liberty to say over an unsecured line. Nolan stopped loading dishes. You think someone's going to come after me? I think you have documentation that could result in criminal charges against powerful people who have significant resources and strong motivation to make that documentation disappear. So you want to take my records into protective custody? We want to make digital copies, verify their authenticity with forensic analysts, and yes, preserve the originals in a secure location. No. Mr. Pierce, those records stay with me. You want copies? Fine. Send someone here with a scanner, but I'm not handing over the only proof I have that I was right about this. Jessica Chen sighed. I'll talk to Ms. Vale. We'll send a team tomorrow morning if that works for you. Make it afternoon. I've got an oil change at 9 and a transmission at 11. Fine. 2 p.m.? Works. He hung up as Elsie emerged from the bathroom, toothbrush dangling from her mouth. Who off that? She mumbled around the toothbrush. Work stuff. Go spit. She trudged back to the bathroom. Nolan heard the water run, heard her humming something that was probably supposed to be the song from whatever cartoon she'd been watching. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The soundtrack of a life he'd built from the rubble of the one that had collapsed 10 years ago. His phone buzzed. Text message from the unknown Detroit number. This is Marin Vale. Jessica said you won't let us secure the records. I understand your hesitation, but please reconsider. These documents are the only hard evidence we have. MV Nolan typed back. They're also the only hard evidence I have. If something happens to them while in your custody, I'm left with nothing. They stay here. The response came fast. Then let us station security at your shop. 24-hour protection until this is resolved. Don't need protection. Need people to leave me alone. Mr. Pierce, please. Conrad Sloan has been with this company for 30 years. He has connections, resources, and a very strong incentive to make sure your documentation never sees a courtroom. I'm not being paranoid. I'm being realistic. Nolan stared at the message. Elsie called from her bedroom that she was ready for a story. The cat, an orange tabby named Wrench, jumped onto the counter and started investigating the leftover mac and cheese. He typed, 1 security guard, outside only, and if anyone in a suit shows up at my daughter's school, this deal is off. Agreed. Thank you. He locked his phone and went to read Elsie a story about a mouse who lived in a department store and had adventures with the stuffed animals after closing time. She fell asleep halfway through chapter 3, her small body curled around her favorite stuffed elephant. Nolan sat in the chair next to her bed for a while after she was asleep, watching her breathe, listening to the house settle around them. 10 years ago, he'd held her in a hospital room and made a promise that he would keep her safe, that he would build a life for them, that he would never let the chaos of the world touch her. Now the chaos was parked outside in a Mercedes, hiding in filing cabinets, buried in engine blocks scattered across the Midwest. His phone buzzed one more time. Another text from Marin Vale. The board voted tonight. We're filing Chapter 11 on Monday. Conrad convinced them it's the only way to survive the lawsuits. I'm sorry. Nolan didn't respond. He turned off his phone, checked the locks on the doors and windows, and went to bed in a house that felt suddenly smaller, more fragile, like it was built from cards instead of boards and nails. Outside, a black SUV pulled up across the street and parked under the broken streetlight. The driver cut the engine, but didn't get out. Just sat there in the dark, watching. Security, probably. Or something else. Nolan closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept circling back to the filing cabinet in his office, to the folders stacked inside, to 10 years of careful documentation that had suddenly become the most dangerous thing he owned. Somewhere in Detroit, in a boardroom overlooking the river, Conrad Sloan was probably having a drink and making phone calls. Calculating. Planning. Protecting the empire he'd spent 3 decades building. And here in Grayford, in a small house on a quiet street, Nolan Pierce lay awake and waited for morning and whatever came with it. The mouse in Elsie's book had been brave enough to face the world outside the department store, had made friends with unlikely allies and found adventure in unexpected places. Nolan hoped like hell this story ended better than that one usually did, because mice, in his experience, tended to get crushed by things much bigger than themselves. And he had a feeling the crushing was about to begin. The security guard's name was Marcus Webb, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He showed up at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before Nolan usually opened the shop, and stood by the black SUV with the posture of a man who'd done too many overnight shifts and not enough stretching. Nolan unlocked the garage bay doors and nodded at him. Marcus nodded back. They didn't speak. It was the beginning of a relationship built entirely on mutual discomfort and contractual obligation. By 8:15, Nolan had the Malibu finished and was elbow-deep in a Ford F-150's transmission when the legal team arrived. 3 people in a silver Lexus. Jessica Chen, who looked exactly like her voice sounded. Crisp, efficient, 20 years of arguing in front of judges. A younger man in glasses who introduced himself as David Park, forensic document analyst. And a woman who didn't introduce herself at all, just started unloading equipment from the trunk. Mr. Pierce, Jessica said, extending a hand Nolan couldn't shake because his were covered in transmission fluid. Thank you for accommodating us. Didn't have much choice. You always have a choice. Nolan wiped his hands and led them to the office. David Park immediately zeroed in on the filing cabinet like a bloodhound catching a scent. The unnamed woman started setting up what looked like a portable scanning station on Nolan's desk, pushing aside the coffee mug Elsie had made him in art class, lumpy, glazed in purple, perfect. We'll need to photograph each document in situ before removal, David said, already pulling on white cotton gloves. Then we'll scan at 600 dpi, create hash values for each file, and document the complete chain of custody. In English, Nolan said. Jessica stepped in. We're going to prove these documents are exactly what you say they are. Contemporaneous records created at the time of each repair, unaltered, authentic. That way, when we present them in court, opposing counsel can't claim they're fabricated or tampered with. They're not fabricated. I believe you. But belief doesn't hold up in federal court. Evidence does. They worked for 3 hours. David photographed every folder, every page, every handwritten note. The unnamed woman, who finally introduced herself as Rita Chen, Jessica's paralegal and also apparently her sister, scanned everything with a machine that hummed and beeped and spit out page after page of perfect digital copies. Nolan tried to work on the F-150, but he kept drifting back to the office doorway, watching strangers handle his records like archaeological artifacts, which, in a way, they were. 10 years of buried truth, carefully excavated. Mr. Pierce, well, David called from the filing cabinet. This notation here, Batch Vivex 7-2847-B, Manufactured week 23, 2015. How did you obtain the batch codes? They're stamped on the engine block, right side below the cylinder head. And you photographed each one? Every single engine that came through here. David made a note on his tablet. This is extraordinarily thorough documentation. Did you have legal training? Engineering training. Same thing, basically. Document everything, assume someone will question your work later. Good instinct. By noon, they were done. Rita had 4 external hard drives loaded with scanned files, each one encrypted and backed up to 3 separate cloud servers. David had a complete photographic record of the filing cabinet's contents, organized by date and cross-referenced with Nolan's repair invoices. Jessica gathered her team by the door. We'll have preliminary forensic analysis by Monday. But Mr. Pierce, I want to be clear, these documents are going to change everything. They establish a clear pattern of ignored warnings, documented failures, and corporate knowledge of a lethal defect. That's the point. The point is also that you're now the star witness in what will likely be the largest automotive safety lawsuit in decades. Your life is about to get complicated. It's already complicated. It's about to get more complicated. She wasn't wrong. The first news van showed up Tuesday morning. Local affiliate, young reporter with ambitious hair and questions Nolan had no intention of answering. Marcus Webb politely but firmly escorted her back to the property line. The second van arrived an hour later, then a third. By Wednesday, there were 6 news trucks parked on Oak Street, their satellite arrays telescoped up like mechanical flowers searching for signal. Nolan kept the garage doors closed and worked on cars. Marcus Webb earned his paycheck keeping reporters at bay. And somewhere in the background, just out of sight, the legal machinery ground forward. Thursday afternoon, Maren Vale came back. She looked worse than the first time. Hair pulled back but coming loose, suit jacket wrinkled like she'd slept in it, dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. She walked past Marcus with a brief nod that suggested they'd met before, maybe multiple times. Nolan was replacing brake pads on a Honda Civic when she appeared in the bay. "Bad week?" he asked without looking up. "You could say that." "Board still pushing bankruptcy?" "Board approved it. We filed Monday morning. Vale Automotive is officially in Chapter 11 reorganization." She said it like she was announcing a death in the family, which, in a way, she was. Nolan torqued the last lug nut and lowered the Civic off the lift. "Sorry. Are you?" "Your grandfather was good to me. Yeah, I'm sorry his company's falling apart. Even though it deserves to?" "Things can deserve to fail and still be worth mourning." Maren leaned against the workbench, suddenly looking exhausted. "The lawyers went through your documentation. David Park says it's some of the most comprehensive failure analysis he's ever seen outside of an NTSB investigation. I'm thorough." "You're angry." Nolan set down his wrench. "Yeah, I'm angry." "At us? At Conrad? At the whole situation?" "Yes." It wasn't the answer she expected, Nolan could tell. She'd been looking for something more specific, more actionable. A villain she could point to and blame. But the truth was messier than that. "I'm angry you fired me for being right," Nolan said. "I'm angry Conrad buried my reports. I'm angry every time I pulled apart another failed engine and knew it didn't have to be this way. And I'm angry at myself for staying quiet because I was scared. You had a daughter to protect. That's what I told myself. But the truth is I could have found a way. Could have contacted NHTSA anonymously, leaked the documents to a reporter, something. Instead, I just fixed engines and kept records and told myself I was playing the long game." He picked up a shop rag and wiped his hands, a gesture so automatic it barely registered. 10 years is a long game. People died in those 10 years. Families lost parents, kids, spouses, because engines failed the way I predicted they would, and I kept quiet. "That's not your fault, isn't it?" Maren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Conrad's blaming you." Nolan went still. "What?" "Not publicly, not yet. But in internal meetings, in conversations with the board, he's building a narrative that you sabotaged the VX7 design, that you were a disgruntled employee who deliberately created a defect so you could later profit from exposing it." "That's insane." "That's strategy. He's trying to discredit you before you can testify. He's pulling your personnel file, your performance reviews, your financial records from when you worked for us, looking for anything he can use to paint you as unstable, vindictive, compromised. Nolan felt something cold settle in his chest. He's going after my credibility. He's going after everything. Your employment history, your divorce, your finances. What about my finances? Marin looked uncomfortable. You filed bankruptcy in 2017, medical bills from Elsie's birth, your ex-wife's student loans. How do you know about that? Conrad's lawyers are building a profile. They're going to argue that you have financial motivation to fabricate evidence, that you're trying to cash in on Vale's crisis. I told you I don't want your money. I know, but Conrad's going to argue you're just plain hard to get, waiting for the settlement offers to get bigger. Nolan threw the shop rag across the bay. It hit the far wall and fell to the concrete with a pathetic slap. So what am I supposed to do? Just let him trash my reputation? You're supposed to let us handle it. Jessica has a forensic accountant reviewing your business records to establish you haven't received any suspicious payments. David's prepared to testify that your documentation is authentic. We're building a case that you're exactly what you appear to be, a mechanic who documented failures in the normal course of business. And what about the part where I used to work for you? Where I have every reason to be bitter? That's where it gets complicated. Marin straightened, and something in her posture changed. She wasn't the exhausted CEO anymore. She was someone who'd spent 3 days in strategy meetings with lawyers who billed $400 an hour. Jessica thinks we need to get ahead of Conrad's narrative. She wants to file a motion to compel Conrad's communications, every email, every memo, every conversation he had about the VX7 defect, and about you. Will she get it? In discovery? Maybe. But it'll take months, and Conrad's lawyers will fight every step. So Jessica has another idea, which is, she wants you to sue us. Nolan stared at her. What? File a wrongful termination suit. Claim Vale Automotive fired you in retaliation for reporting safety defects. It would force the company to produce all internal communications about your termination, about the VX7 development, about everything Conrad did to bury your warnings. You want me to sue you to help you sue yourselves? I want you to sue Vale Automotive as it existed under Conrad Sloan's leadership. I want to draw a clear line between the company that ignored your warnings and the company I'm trying to build from what's left. Nolan walked to the bay door and looked out at Oak Street. The news vans were still there, idling, waiting. Marcus Webb was on his phone, probably reporting this conversation to whoever was actually paying his salary. And somewhere, in an office tower in Detroit, Conrad Sloan was spinning narratives and building defenses and doing everything he could to make sure the empire didn't fall on him. If I sue you, Nolan said slowly, Conrad will come at me with everything. He'll drag out every mistake I ever made, every bill I couldn't pay, every time you were human, Marin finished. Yes, he will. And we need to make sure you're ready for that. I don't know if I am. Mr. Pierce, Nolan, I know this isn't fair. I know you never asked to be the center of this, but you're the only person outside Vale Automotive who has contemporaneous documentation of what went wrong. You're the only one who can prove Conrad knew about the defect and buried it. Why does it have to be me? It was a question Nolan had been asking himself for 10 years, in different forms, in different contexts. Why did it have to be him who noticed the defect? Why did it have to be him who filed the reports? Why did it have to be him who got fired, who lost everything, who spent a decade fixing the same broken engines over and over? Marin didn't have an answer. Nobody did. Sometimes you were just the person standing in the right place or the wrong place when history decided to happen. I need to think about it, Nolan said finally. Take until tomorrow. After that, Conrad's going to file his motion to exclude your testimony. He's going to argue you're not a qualified expert, that your documentation is hearsay, that you have undisclosed financial interest in the outcome. Once he does that, the window for us to get ahead of the narrative closes. She handed him a business card, her personal cell number, written on the back in the same kind of precise handwriting Nolan used in his repair notes. Engineers, apparently, never lost certain habits. Call me tonight, either way. Then she was gone, back to the Mercedes, back to Detroit, back to the war that was being fought in conference rooms and courtrooms, while Nolan stood in a garage that smelled like brake fluid and old coffee. He worked until 6, then drove home. Elsie was at Mrs. Patterson's house, their standing Thursday arrangement, because Mrs. Patterson liked having someone to cook for, and Elsie liked Mrs. Patterson's cat. Nolan picked her up, and they drove home through streets that felt suddenly unfamiliar, like he was seeing them from the wrong angle. Dad, why are there cameras outside our house? Nolan looked. She was right. Two news vans parked on the street, cameras pointed at the small house like it was a crime scene. Work stuff. What kind of work stuff needs cameras? Boring adult work stuff. Is it about the car company, the one you used to work for? Nolan pulled into the driveway and put the car in park. He should have known she'd figure it out. Elsie was 6, but she paid attention. She noticed things. It was one of the ways she was exactly like him. Yeah, he said. It's about the car company. Are you in trouble? No, but some people at the company are. Because of the engines you said were broken? Yeah. Elsie unbuckled her seatbelt and looked at him with those two perceptive eyes. Are they mad at you for being right? Some of them are. That's still dumb. Yeah, Bug. It is. They went inside. Nolan made spaghetti while Elsie did homework at the kitchen table. The news van stayed outside. Marcus Webb's replacement, a woman named Torres who looked like she could bench press the SUV she arrived in, parked across the street and settled in for the night shift. At 8:47, after Elsie was in bed, Nolan's phone rang. Unknown number, New York area code. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Pierce? This is Richard Kelso. I'm a producer for Frontline. We're working on an investigation into Vail Automotive's safety practices, and we'd like to talk to you. I'm not interested. We've spoken with 3 families who lost loved ones in VX7 engine failures. They deserve to know the truth about what happened. You can help them understand. Call Vail's PR department. Mr. Pierce, we know you documented these failures for years. We know you tried to warn the company. Don't you think the public deserves to hear that story? The public can hear it in court. If it gets to court, Conrad Sloan has a reputation for making these things disappear. Settlements, NDAs, legal maneuvers that keep the truth buried. But if you go on record now... Nolan hung up. The phone rang again. Same number. He blocked it. 2 minutes later, a text from a different number. Mr. Pierce, this is Amanda Reeves, Washington Post. We're publishing a story on Vail Automotive next week. I'd like to include your perspective. Can we talk? Nolan turned off his phone. In the silence that followed, he could hear the house settling around him. The refrigerator's hum, the heat kicking on. Elsie's soft breathing from down the hall, audible through the crack in her door. He thought about Marin's offer, about suing Vail Automotive, about forcing Conrad's communications into the open, about becoming the public face of a corporate scandal that was about to consume everything. He thought about the news vans outside and the reporters calling and the forensic accountants digging through his finances looking for evidence of what? What did they think they'd find? He ran a 2-bay garage in Ohio. His biggest monthly expense was Elsie's orthodontist savings fund. He thought about Conrad Sloan in a Detroit office tower, probably drinking expensive scotch and making plans. At 9:23, Nolan turned his phone back on and called the number Marin had written on the card. She answered on the first ring. Did you decide? If I do this, if I sue, I need protection, real protection, not just Marcus Webb sitting outside my shop. What kind of protection? Legal. I need your lawyers to represent me in the wrongful termination suit. I need them to shield my finances, my history, everything Conrad's going to try to use against me. Done. And I need you to keep Elsie out of this. No cameras at her school, no reporters following her, nothing that touches her. I can't control the media. Then control your media people. Put out a statement that my daughter is off limits. Make it clear that anyone who approaches her will face legal action. There was a pause, then Marin said, Okay, I'll talk to our communications team. And one more thing. What? When this is over, when Conrad's dealt with and the truth comes out and Vail Automotive either survives or doesn't, I want my name back. Your name? I designed the VX7 platform. Before Conrad pushed it into production, before the defect, before everything went wrong, I designed an engine that worked. An engine that would have been safe if it had been manufactured correctly. And I want credit for that. Not for the failure, for the design that Conrad corrupted. Marin was quiet for a long moment. I'll see what I can do. That's not good enough. I want it in writing. Part of whatever settlement comes out of the wrongful termination suit. My name goes back on the VX7 patent, the original design, before Conrad's changes. That's That's not a simple ask. Patent attribution is complicated, and I don't care how complicated it is. That's the price. You want me to be your star witness? You want me to sue your company? You want me to stand up in court and destroy Conrad Sloan? Fine. But I get my name back. Another pause. Then, I'll have Jessica drafted into the agreement. Good. Nolan, thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get ugly. I know. He hung up and sat in the dark kitchen for a while, listening to the house and trying to convince himself he'd made the right choice. Tomorrow, Jessica Chen would file a wrongful termination lawsuit, Nolan Pierce versus Vale Automotive Systems. And the clock would start ticking on whatever Conrad Sloan had planned. Nolan stood and checked the locks on the doors, checked the windows, checked Elsie's room where she slept curled around her elephant. Everything looked the same as it always did. But something had shifted. The world had tilted on its axis, and there was no going back to the way things were before Marin Vale walked into his garage with questions about defective engines. He went to bed but didn't sleep. Just lay there, listening to Torres's SUV idling outside, to the distant sound of someone's TV through the walls, to all the ordinary noises of an ordinary night that wasn't ordinary at all. And sometime around 3 a.m., his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You made a mistake, Pierce. You should have stayed quiet. No signature, no identifying information, just a threat delivered through encrypted text from someone who wanted him to know they were watching. Nolan got out of bed and looked out the window. Torres was still there in the SUV. The news vans were gone. Even reporters needed sleep. The street was empty except for shadows and streetlights and the ordinary darkness of a small Ohio town at night. But someone was out there, watching, waiting. He checked on Elsie again. Still sleeping, still safe, still blissfully unaware that her father had just painted a target on both their backs. Nolan went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until dawn crept through the windows and Friday morning arrived with all its implications. At 7:15, his phone rang. Jessica Chen. We're filing in 1 hour. Are you ready? No. Good. Nobody who's actually ready for this kind of fight ever wins. It's the scared ones who find out what they're made of. That's supposed to be inspiring? It's supposed to be true. Conrad's going to come at you hard. He's going to dig up everything, your bankruptcy, your divorce, every parking ticket and late payment and mistake you've ever made. He's going to try to make you look desperate, unstable, compromised. I know. And you need to let him. You need to stand there and take it and not flinch. Because every attack he makes, every bit of dirt he throws, it just proves he's desperate. It proves you're the threat he can't neutralize any other way. Nolan thought about that. About being the threat. About being the one person Conrad Sloan couldn't buy, or intimidate, or make disappear. File the suit, he said. Already done. I filed it at 7 a.m. It'll hit the docket in Detroit by noon, and by 1 p.m. every news outlet in the country will be running the story. Former Vale engineer sues company over retaliation for safety warnings. It's going to be everywhere. Great. Nolan, this is the right thing. Doesn't make it easier. No, but it makes it worth it. She hung up. Nolan made coffee, got Elsie up, and fed and off to school with Mrs. Patterson, then drove to the shop. Marcus Webb was back on duty, looking tired but alert. The news vans had returned, multiplied, metastasized. There were at least a dozen now, plus print reporters with notebooks and photographers with telephoto lenses. Nolan parked in the bay and closed the door behind him before any of them could get close enough to shout questions. He had 4 cars scheduled for the day. An oil change, a brake job, a diagnostic on a check engine light, and a transmission that was probably terminal. Ordinary work. Normal work. The kind of thing he'd been doing for 10 years. He started with the oil change and tried not to think about the lawsuit that was about to make his name national news. At 1:07 p.m., his phone exploded with notifications, news alerts, text messages, emails from addresses he didn't recognize. He ignored them all and focused on the brake job. At 2:34, a process server showed up with papers from Conrad Sloan's legal team, a motion to dismiss the wrongful termination suit, a countersuit for defamation and breach of NDA, and a subpoena for every document, every record, every piece of evidence Nolan had collected in the past 10 years. Marcus Webb signed for the papers and brought them to Nolan. You expecting these? Marcus asked. Yeah. You need anything? Nolan looked at the stack of legal documents, then at the brake pads he was installing, then back at Marcus. Coffee? Black? Strong enough to strip paint? Marcus almost smiled. I'll see what I can do. By the time Nolan finished the brake job, Jessica Chen had called 3 times. Marin Vale had texted twice, and someone claiming to be from the FBI had left a voicemail asking him to call back. He ignored them all and moved on to the diagnostic. The check engine light was a bad O2 sensor. Easy fix. He had it done in 40 minutes. The transmission was, as suspected, terminal. He called the customer and gave them the bad news. They asked if he could do anything. He said no, but he could recommend a good dealership for a replacement vehicle. They thanked him and hung up. Another ordinary transaction in an increasingly unordinary day. At 5:47, just as Nolan was cleaning up to go pick up Elsie, Marin Vale arrived again. She looked wired, running on coffee and adrenaline and whatever kept CEOs functional during corporate collapse. Did you see the news? She asked. I've been working. It's everywhere. Every major outlet is running the story. Vale engineer claims retaliation for safety warnings. Conrad scrambling. He put out a statement calling you a disgruntled ex-employee with financial problems and a grudge. Sounds about right. Nolan, this is serious. He's trying to destroy your credibility before you can testify. I know. And you're just, what, changing oil and replacing brake pads? What else am I supposed to do? Marin stared at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Most people would be panicking, calling lawyers, strategizing, preparing for the fight. I've been preparing for this fight for 10 years. Another day of brake pads isn't going to change anything. She sat on the workbench, suddenly looking exhausted again. Conrad's board allies are calling for my resignation. They're saying I'm mishandling the crisis, that I'm making it worse by supporting your lawsuit. Are you going to resign? No. Good. They sat in silence for a moment. 2 people who'd been pulled into a collision neither of them wanted, but both were too stubborn to walk away from. Jessica says Conrad's going to depose you next week, Marin said. His lawyers will ask you about everything, your employment, your finances, your relationship with me, every detail of how you collected your evidence. Let them ask. They're going to try to trip you up, get you to contradict yourself, admit to something that makes you look biased or compromised. I'll tell the truth, same as I've been doing. Truth isn't always enough, not in court, not when the other side has better lawyers and deeper pockets and a willingness to lie. Nolan stood and started putting away tools. You know what I learned in 10 years of running this shop? Engines don't lie. You can spin narratives and build arguments and hire fancy lawyers, but at the end of the day, metal either holds or it breaks. The VX7 engines broke. They broke exactly the way I said they would, and no amount of Conrad's legal maneuvering changes that. I hope you're right. I am, because I did the math. Marin left. Nolan locked up the shop, waved to Marcus Webb, and drove home through streets lined with news vans and curious neighbors and the weight of a decision that was already shaping into consequences. Elsie was waiting at Mrs. Patterson's, full of stories about art class and recess and a kid named Tyler who'd fallen off the monkey bars. Normal 6-year-old concerns. The world as it should be. They went home and made tacos and watched a nature documentary about emperor penguins. Elsie fell asleep on the couch halfway through. Nolan carried her to bed, tucked her in, kissed her forehead. Then he sat at the kitchen table and read through the papers Marcus had delivered. Conrad's motion to dismiss, his countersuit, the subpoena. It was all there in legal language. The accusation that Nolan had fabricated evidence, that he was motivated by financial gain, that his documentation was unreliable and his testimony worthless. Nolan made notes in the margins, factual errors, provable lies, accusations that didn't match the timeline. By midnight, he had a 3-page response drafted in the same precise handwriting he used for repair notes. He emailed it to Jessica Chen with a subject line that just said, "Corrections." Her response came back in 4 minutes. "Are you always this thorough?" Nolan typed, "I'm an engineer. Thoroughness is the job. Conrad's going to hate you. He already does. Good. That means you're winning." Nolan closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the house settle and Torres's SUV idling and the ordinary sounds of a life that had become extraordinary without his permission. Tomorrow was Saturday. He had 6 cars scheduled, a backlog of work that wouldn't care about lawsuits or depositions or the corporate warfare happening in Detroit. And somewhere, in an office tower overlooking a river, Conrad Sloan was making plans. But so was Nolan Pierce, and he'd had 10 years to get his plans exactly right. The deposition was scheduled for Tuesday at 9 a.m. in a conference room that probably cost more per hour than Nolan made in a week. Jessica Chen picked him up at 7. She didn't trust him to drive to Detroit on his own, which was fair because Nolan had seriously considered not showing up at all. "Wear the blue shirt," she told him on the phone. "Not the one with the grease stain, the other blue one. I only have one blue shirt." "Then buy another one." He'd bought another one. It felt stiff and wrong, like he was wearing someone else's skin. They drove in silence for the first hour. Jessica kept glancing at the notes on her tablet, then at Nolan, then back at the notes. Finally, she said, "Conrad's lead attorney is Martin Vickers. He's been doing corporate defense for 30 years. He's good at making witnesses look stupid." "I'll try not to be stupid. That's not what I mean. He's going to ask you the same question 5 different ways, trying to get you to contradict yourself. He's going to imply things without stating them directly. He's going to make you angry, so you say something you regret." "I don't get angry." Jessica looked at him. "Everyone gets angry. Not in a way that shows." They pulled into the parking garage of a glass tower that reflected the gray Detroit sky like a mirror. The building directory listed Vail Automotive Systems on floors 12 through 18. Conrad's lawyers were on 23. The conference room had windows that looked out over the river, and furniture that was aggressively expensive in that way designed to intimidate. Martin Vickers was already there, along with 2 associates who looked fresh out of law school and hungry to prove something. A court reporter sat in the corner, fingers poised over the stenotype machine. Conrad Sloan sat at the far end of the table. He was older than Nolan remembered. Early 60s now, hair gone silver but still thick, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Nolan's car. He looked at Nolan the way you'd look at a bug that had somehow made it inside despite your best efforts at pest control. "Mr. Pierce," Vickers said, standing. He was tall, angular, the kind of man who'd probably played basketball in college and still mentioned it at parties. "Thank you for being here." "Didn't have a choice. Nevertheless, please sit." Nolan sat. Jessica sat next to him. The court reporter's fingers started moving. Vickers began with the easy questions. Name, address, employment history. Nolan answered in the same flat tone he used when explaining to customers why their transmission was toast. Facts, no emotion, nothing that could be twisted. Then Vickers shifted gears. "Mr. Pierce, you filed bankruptcy in 2017. Is that correct?" "Yes." "What were the circumstances?" "Medical bills for my daughter's birth. Student loans my ex-wife left me with when she filed for divorce. General cost of trying to keep a business running while raising a kid alone." "So you were in financial distress?" "I was in the same financial distress as half of America." "Did you seek any financial assistance from Vail Automotive after your termination?" "No." "Did you contact anyone at the company asking for money?" "No." "Did you ever consider selling the documentation you'd collected to a competitor? To the media? To plaintiffs' attorneys?" "No." Vickers made a note. "Mr. Pierce, you claim you documented VX7 engine failures for 10 years. Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Jessica touched Nolan's arm, a signal they'd agreed on. "Careful here." "I was bound by an NDA, Nolan said. "Your client made it very clear that discussing proprietary company information would result in legal action. But you're claiming Vail Automotive retaliated against you for reporting safety concerns. If that's true, wouldn't the NDA be unenforceable?" "I'm not a lawyer. I just knew signing it was the only way to get my severance package, and I had a kid to feed." "So you prioritized your financial situation over public safety." Jessica cut in. "That's a characterization, not a question." Vickers smiled. "Let me rephrase. Mr. Pierce, you had documentation of what you claim were dangerous defects. You could have contacted NHTSA anonymously. You could have leaked the information to the press. Instead, you stayed silent and continued to profit from repairing the defective engines. Is that accurate?" The room went very quiet. Conrad was watching Nolan with an expression that might have been satisfaction. The associates were taking notes. The court reporter's fingers kept moving. Nolan took a breath. I stayed silent because I was scared. Scared of losing my business, losing custody of my daughter, losing everything I'd built after your client destroyed my career. So yeah, I fixed engines and kept records and told myself it was enough. You want to judge me for that? Go ahead, but don't pretend like I had choices I didn't have. You had the choice to act. I had the choice to destroy my life or protect my kid. I chose my kid, and I'd make the same choice again. Vickers glanced at Conrad, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then he pulled out a document and slid it across the table. Do you recognize this? Nolan looked. It was an email. His email from 2014 sent to his supervisor 3 months before the VX7 went into production. Yeah, I recognize it. Can you read the highlighted portion? Nolan read aloud. The current alloy mixture isn't testing within acceptable parameters. We need another 6 months to resolve the heat treating issues before we can recommend this design for production. And what happened after you sent this email? I was told the timeline couldn't change, that we had a contract deadline to meet, and I needed to make the design work within the existing schedule. Who told you that? Nolan looked directly at Conrad. He did. Conrad's expression didn't change. He might have been carved from the same expensive wood as the conference table. Vickers pulled out another document. This is a performance review from November 2014. It indicates you were struggling to meet deadlines, that you were resistant to team feedback, that you had difficulty accepting direction from supervisors. Does that sound accurate? No. You're saying the review is fabricated? I'm saying it was written by someone who wanted to justify firing me before I could cause more problems. Who wrote it? Nolan nodded at Conrad again. He did. Vickers spent the next 2 hours trying to poke holes in Nolan's timeline, his documentation methods, his motivations. He brought up the bankruptcy again, implying Nolan was desperate for money. He questioned why Nolan had kept such detailed records if he wasn't planning to use them for profit. He suggested Nolan had falsified repair dates to make the pattern look worse than it was. Nolan answered every question the same way. Facts, no emotion, nothing that could be twisted. At 1:15, they broke for lunch. Jessica led Nolan to a small conference room down the hall and closed the door. You're doing good, she said. He's trying to rattle you, and it's not working. He's trying to make me look like a liar. He's trying to make you look motivated by money, which is why we need to establish that you're not. This afternoon, I'm going to ask you about your finances. Be honest. If you struggled, say so. If you made mistakes, own them. The worst thing you can do is look like you're hiding something. They ate sandwiches from the building cafeteria. Nolan barely tasted his. Through the window, he could see the river and the Windsor skyline beyond it, and the whole landscape of a city that had built itself on making things, then slowly forgotten how. At 2 p.m., they resumed. Vickers pulled out more documents, Nolan's tax returns, business records, bank statements from the bankruptcy filing. He went through them line by line, highlighting every late payment, every overdraft, every month where Nolan had barely made rent. February 2017, Vickers said. You were 37 days late on your mortgage payment. Yeah. April 2017, you borrowed $3,000 from your father. Yeah. June 2017, you sold your wife's engagement ring to a pawn shop. Nolan felt something tight in his chest. Ex-wife. And yeah, I sold it. Because you needed money. Because I needed to keep the lights on and feed my kid. And now, 10 years later, you're suing Vail Automotive for wrongful termination, seeking damages that could amount to millions of dollars. Isn't that convenient timing? Jessica started to object, but Nolan held up a hand. He looked at Vickers, then at Conrad, then back at Vickers. You want to know why I'm suing now? Because your client spent 10 years covering up a defect that killed people. Because families lost loved ones, and Vail Automotive blamed driver error, or poor maintenance, or anything except the truth, and because someone needed to stand up and say what actually happened. Nolan's voice was steady, quiet, harder than the engine blocks he'd been pulling apart for a decade. You can question my finances all you want. You can imply I'm motivated by money, but at the end of the day, I have 217 documented engine failures that prove I was right, and your client was wrong, and no amount of legal maneuvering changes that. The room was silent except for the court reporter's fingers and the distant hum of the building's HVAC. Vickers closed his folder. No further questions. Conrad stood. Actually, I have a few. Vickers looked surprised. Mr. Sloan, we discussed... I'm aware of what we discussed, Martin, but I'd like to ask Mr. Pierce some questions myself. Jessica leaned forward. This is highly irregular. This is my deposition. I'm entitled to ask questions. Conrad moved to the head of the table, positioning himself directly across from Nolan. Mr. Pierce, do you believe you were the only engineer at Vale Automotive who identified potential issues with the VX7 design? Nolan hesitated. This felt like a trap. I don't know what other engineers identified, but you were the most vocal about it. I filed 3 reports. If that makes me the most vocal, then yeah. And when those reports were dismissed, how did that make you feel? Frustrated. Angry? Yeah, angry. Angry enough to want revenge, Jessica cut in. Mr. Sloan, that's clearly argumentative. Angry enough to deliberately keep records for 10 years so you could eventually destroy the company that fired you? Nolan stared at Conrad across the table. Up close, he could see the slight tremor in the older man's hands, the way his jaw was clenched too tight. Conrad wasn't just defending his legacy. He was scared. I kept records, Nolan said slowly, because I knew the engines would fail. I knew people would get hurt. And I knew that when it happened, someone needed to have proof of what went wrong and who ignored the warnings. If that's revenge, fine. Call it revenge. But it's also the truth. The truth according to a disgruntled ex-employee with financial problems and an axe to grind. The truth according to 217 failed engines that all cracked in exactly the pattern I predicted. Conrad leaned forward. You know what I think, Mr. Pierce? I think you were a mediocre engineer who made a lucky guess. The VX7 had issues, yes, but every engine design has issues. That's what testing and refinement are for. You wanted to delay production for 6 months, maybe a year. Do you know what that would have cost us? What it would have cost the dealerships, the assembly plants, the thousands of workers who depend on Vale Automotive for their livelihoods. More than 743 catastrophic failures? Those failures happened over 10 years, across millions of vehicles. The failure rate is a fraction of a percent. Tell that to the families of the people who died. Conrad's face went red. You self-righteous. You sit here in your cheap suit and your moral superiority, acting like you're the hero. But you're not. You're a man who stayed silent for a decade because it was convenient, who fixed engines and collected evidence and waited for the perfect moment to cash in. You're not a whistleblower. You're an opportunist. Mr. Sloan, Jessica said sharply, this is completely inappropriate. And you know what else? Conrad wasn't done. I looked into your background. Your father was a union organizer who spent 20 years fighting Vale Automotive. Your mother picketed outside our plants in the 80s. You grew up hating this company, and the moment you got hired, you started looking for ways to damage us. Nolan felt the room tilt slightly. That's not true. Isn't it? You came in with a chip on your shoulder, always questioning decisions, always pushing back, always... I came in wanting to build engines that worked, that didn't kill people. If that's having a chip on my shoulder, then yeah, I'm guilty. Conrad slammed his hand on the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. You cost this company billions of dollars. You destroyed our reputation. I documented the truth. You're the one who buried it. I made a business decision. The words hung in the air. Vickers looked like he wanted to disappear into the expensive carpeting. The associates had stopped taking notes. The court reporter's fingers were frozen over the keys. Conrad seemed to realize what he'd said. What I meant was, you made a business decision, Nolan repeated quietly, to hide a defect, to push defective engines into production, to prioritize profit over safety. That's not what I said. That's exactly what you said, and it's on the record now. Conrad looked at Vickers. Vickers looked at his notes. Nobody looked at the court reporter, but everyone was thinking about her and the transcript that would soon exist of Conrad Sloan admitting to exactly what Marin and Jessica and Nolan had suspected all along. We're done here, Conrad said. He walked out of the conference room, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded final. Vickers gathered his papers. We'll need to strike Mr. Sloan's comments from the record. Jessica smiled. I don't think so. They were clearly made in anger, not indicative of, they were made under oath, Martin. You know as well as I do they're admissible. Vickers looked at Nolan with something that might have been respect or might have been resignation. You got what you wanted. I got the truth, Nolan said. That's all I ever wanted. They left the building. Outside, the sky had gone from gray to darker gray, and the first drops of rain were starting to fall. Jessica practically ran to the car, pulling out her phone before they even reached the parking garage. I'm calling Marin, she said. Conrad just handed us the entire case. Nolan sat in the passenger seat and watched the rain streak down the windshield. He should have felt victorious, should have felt something, but mostly he just felt tired. Jessica was on the phone, talking rapidly. He admitted it, on the record. Said he made a business decision. We have him. We actually have him. Nolan closed his eyes and listened to the rain. They drove back to Grayford in silence. Jessica dropped him at the shop, where Marcus Webb was dealing with a small crowd of reporters who'd somehow learned about the deposition. Nolan walked past them without answering questions, unlocked the bay door, and stepped into the familiar smell of oil and metal. He had work to do. A timing belt replacement that should have been done yesterday. A coolant leak that was probably just a loose hose clamp. Normal things. Ordinary things. His phone rang. Marin. Jessica told me what happened, she said. Conrad's lawyers are already trying to walk it back, but the transcript is clear. He admitted to making a business decision about the defect. Good. Good? Nolan, this changes everything. We can use this to force a settlement, to get Conrad removed from the board, to... I need to finish a timing belt. What? Customer needs her car by tomorrow. I need to finish the timing belt. Marin was quiet for a moment. Are you okay? Yeah, just tired. We should celebrate. This is a huge win. You celebrate. I have work. He hung up and stared at the Toyota Camry in front of him. The timing belt was worn, teeth showing stress fractures where the rubber had degraded. It would fail soon. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when it did, the engine would destroy itself from the inside out. Nolan replaced the belt with a new one, checked the tension, verified the timing marks, reassembled everything with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. At 7 p.m., he locked up and drove home. The news vans were back, cameras pointed at his house like artillery. Torres was in the usual spot, sipping coffee from a thermos. Elsie was at the kitchen table with Mrs. Patterson, working on a book report about a story involving a mouse and a motorcycle. She looked up when Nolan came in. How was work? Long. Mrs. Patterson made meatloaf. I can see that. Mrs. Patterson stood gathering her things. I should go. Let you two have dinner. After she left, Nolan and Elsie ate meatloaf that was slightly dry and mashed potatoes that were slightly lumpy and corn from a can that was exactly what it needed to be. Dad? Yeah, Bug? Kids at school are saying you're famous. Nolan set down his fork. I'm not famous. Tyler's mom saw you on the news. She said you're the guy who's fighting the car company. I'm not fighting anyone. I'm just telling the truth. About the broken engines? Yeah. Elsie pushed corn around her plate. Are the people who made the broken engines going to get in trouble? Probably. Good. They should get in trouble for making things that hurt people. Yeah, Nolan said. They should. After dinner, they watched a documentary about deep-sea creatures. Elsie fell asleep during the segment about anglerfish. Nolan carried her to bed, tucked her in, stood in the doorway watching her sleep. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. We need to talk. Meet me at the corner diner, 10 p.m. Come alone. Bernard Pierce. Nolan stared at the message. Bernard Pierce was his father. They hadn't spoken in 3 years. Not since the argument about Nolan's mother's funeral, about the will, about a lifetime of complicated history neither of them knew how to resolve. He texted back, How did you get this number? Saw you on the news. Tracked down your shop number. We need to talk about Conrad Sloan. Nothing to talk about. Yes, there is. 10 p.m. I'll be there. Nolan deleted the message. Then he called Torres. Yeah? She sounded alert, professional. I need to go out for an hour. Can you stay with my daughter? Just be in the house. Make sure nobody bothers her. That's not really in my job description. I'll pay you extra. Torres was quiet for a moment. Where are you going? Meeting someone. Who? My father. That a good idea? Probably not, but I'm going anyway. Torres showed up 15 minutes later. Nolan gave her the quick tour. Elsie's room, emergency numbers, where the coffee was. Then he drove to the corner diner, a 24-hour place on Route 18 that had been there since before Nolan was born. Bernard Pierce was in the back booth, drinking coffee and looking older than Nolan remembered. His hair had gone fully gray, his face lined with the kind of deep creases that came from decades of outdoor work and not enough sunscreen. "You look like hell," Bernard said. "Thanks. You too." Nolan slid into the booth. The waitress came over, Linda, who'd been working here for at least 20 years, and poured him coffee without asking. "So," Bernard said, "Conrad Sloan. What about him?" "You know I worked Vail Automotive Assembly for 32 years. Know what I did for the last 10 of those?" "Not really." "Documented safety violations. Took photos of faulty welds, logged production shortcuts, kept records of every corner Conrad cut to meet quotas." Bernard took a sip of coffee. "Got me fired in 2009. They called it early retirement, gave me a package to keep quiet." Nolan set down his cup. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I read about your lawsuit, about your documentation, and I realized something." Bernard pulled a battered notebook from his jacket. "You got your meticulous record keeping from me. Your mother always said I was obsessive. Maybe she was right." The notebook was filled with dates, times, batch numbers, photos glued to pages, annotations in Bernard's tight handwriting. It looked exactly like Nolan's files, just focused on assembly line issues instead of engine design. "Conrad didn't just bury your reports about the VX7, Bernard said. "He buried mine about the manufacturing process. I told him the accelerated production timeline was creating quality control problems, that rushing assembly was introducing defects we wouldn't catch until vehicles were already shipped." Nolan looked at his father. "You never told me you worked on the VX7. "You never asked. We weren't exactly talking much back then." "We're not exactly talking much now." Bernard closed the notebook. "I know, and that's on me. But Nolan, Conrad Sloan destroyed both our careers. He fired you for being right about the design. He fired me for being right about the manufacturing. And he's still there, still making decisions, still covering his ass while people die. So what do you want?" "I want to give you this." Bernard slid the notebook across the table. "Everything I documented. Every shortcut, every violation, every conversation where Conrad told us to speed up production and ignore the quality metrics." Nolan looked at the notebook like it might explode. "Why now? Why not give this to the NHTSA years ago?" "Same reason you didn't. I had bills to pay, a family to support. The severance package came with an NDA, and I was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of caring, tired of watching the company my grandfather helped build turn into something unrecognizable." "Your grandfather worked for Vail?" "In the 40s, tool and die maker. Met Marin's great-grandfather when the company was just getting started." Bernard smiled slightly. "So, yeah, I've got history with Vail Automotive, just like you, just like half this town." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a semi rumbled past on the highway, engine noise rattling the diner windows. "There's something else," Bernard said. "Conrad's been asking around about you, calling people from the old union, trying to dig up dirt." "Let him dig." "He's saying you falsified your records, that you're working with competitors to destroy Vail's reputation." "That's ridiculous." "Of course it's ridiculous, but Conrad's good at making ridiculous things sound plausible. He's been doing it for 30 years. Bernard leaned forward. "You need to be careful. Conrad's cornered, and cornered men do desperate things. I have security. Security can't stop rumors. Can't stop him from poisoning the well before your case ever gets to trial." Nolan picked up the notebook. It was heavy, substantial, filled with the same kind of obsessive documentation that had filled his own filing cabinet. "If I use this, you'll be pulled into the lawsuit. Your NDA, your severance package, all of it goes away." "I know. You're okay with that?" Bernard looked out the window at the highway, at the trucks passing in the night, at the landscape of a life spent building things and watching them fall apart. "I'm 71 years old, Nolan. I've got a pension from the union and a house that's paid off. What's Conrad going to do, sue me? Take my used Buick?" "He could. Let him try. I'm done being quiet." Bernard met Nolan's eyes. "I should have done this years ago. Should have stood up, made noise, forced them to listen. But I didn't. I took the money and stayed quiet and told myself it wasn't my problem anymore. You had reasons. Reasons aren't the same as being right. Bernard stood, pulled out his wallet, left cash on the table for the coffee. Use the notebook. Don't use it. That's up to you. But I wanted you to know you're not alone in this. You never were. He walked out into the night. Nolan sat in the booth, holding his father's notebook, watching the highway through the window. Linda came over with the coffee pot. Your dad's a good man. Stubborn, but good. Yeah, Nolan said. He is. He drove home at 11:07, the notebook on the passenger seat. Torres was on the couch, watching a cooking show with the sound low. Everything okay? She asked. Yeah, thanks for staying. Kid didn't even wake up. Easy money. After Torres left, Nolan sat at the kitchen table and went through his father's notebook page by page. It was all there. Production schedules that had been accelerated by weeks, quality checkpoints that had been skipped, inspection reports that had been falsified. And every page had Conrad Sloan's signature authorizing the changes, approving the shortcuts. Combined with Nolan's engine documentation, it painted a complete picture. Conrad had pushed a defective design into accelerated production, ignored warnings from both engineering and manufacturing, and spent 10 years covering up the results. At 1:34 a.m., Nolan photographed every page of the notebook and emailed them to Jessica Chen with a subject line that just said, "More evidence," from the assembly side. Her response came at 1:36. Where did you get this? My father. He worked Vail Assembly until 2009, documented the same problems from the manufacturing perspective. Nolan, this is everything we needed. Production records, Conrad's signatures, contemporaneous documentation from a completely independent source. We can prove systemic knowledge and deliberate concealment. Good. Can your father testify? Nolan thought about Bernard in the diner, about the notebook sliding across the table, about a 71-year-old man who was done being quiet. Yes. I'll call him tomorrow. Get some sleep. Nolan closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the house settle and the distant sound of Torres's SUV starting up outside and the ordinary silence of 2 a.m. in a small Ohio town. Tomorrow, Conrad Sloan would wake up to the news that the case against him had just gotten exponentially stronger, that a second witness had emerged with documentation proving systematic safety violations, that the walls were closing in. Tomorrow, Marin Vail would probably call with updates on the bankruptcy proceedings, the board meetings, the endless legal maneuvering. Tomorrow, the news vans would return and the reporters would ask questions, and the machinery of justice would grind forward another increment. But tonight, Nolan just sat in the kitchen his daughter had learned to make mac and cheese in, holding a notebook his father had carried for 17 years, thinking about the strange inheritance of fighting the same fights across generations. His phone buzzed one more time. Text from Bernard. Your mother would be proud of you. I am too. Nolan typed back. Thanks, Dad. Then he went to bed in a house that felt slightly less small, slightly less fragile than it had that morning. Outside, the streetlight flickered and held. The night settled into itself. And somewhere in Detroit, in a different house, a different life, Conrad Sloan was probably lying awake too, calculating exits and planning defenses, and realizing that the empire he'd spent 3 decades building was coming down around him one documented failure at a time. Bernard's testimony was scheduled for Thursday, which gave Conrad Sloan's legal team exactly 5 days to try to discredit a 71-year-old former assembly worker who'd kept a notebook for 17 years. They used every single one of those days. On Monday, a story appeared in the Detroit Free Press suggesting Bernard Pierce had been fired from Vail Automotive for theft, not early retirement. The article cited unnamed sources and included details about a missing toolbox that had supposedly been found in Bernard's car on his last day of work. It's a lie, Bernard told Nolan over the phone. His voice was steady, but Nolan could hear the anger underneath. I never stole anything. They gave me the toolbox as a retirement gift. I have the card signed by my supervisor. Do you still have the card? Somewhere. Maybe. Hell, it's been almost 20 years. Jessica Chen filed a defamation suit against the newspaper by Tuesday afternoon, but the damage was done. The story had been picked up by 3 other outlets, each one adding new unverified details. By Wednesday, Conrad's version of events was the one people remembered. On Tuesday morning, Nolan found his shop's Yelp page flooded with one-star reviews. Complaints about overcharging, shoddy work, rude service, all posted within a 6-hour window, all from accounts created in the past week. Marcus Webb helped him document everything. Classic reputation attack, he said, screenshotting each review. Someone hired a service to flood your ratings. Can we prove it was Conrad? Prove it? No. Know it? Absolutely. By Tuesday afternoon, 3 customers had called to cancel appointments, apologetically citing the reviews. Mrs. Patterson came by to tell him she didn't believe a word of it, which somehow made it worse because it meant people were talking. On Wednesday, someone leaked Bernard's medical records to a blog that specialized in corporate conspiracy theories. The records showed Bernard had been treated for depression in 2010, the year after his retirement. The blog post implied he was unstable, that his documentation couldn't be trusted, that his testimony was motivated by mental illness rather than truth. That's a HIPAA violation, Jessica said when Nolan called her. Someone at his doctor's office or at the insurance company, or we'll find out who leaked it. We'll press charges. Will it matter? Jessica was quiet. The records are out there now. Conrad's lawyers will use them to question Bernard's credibility. They'll suggest the depression affected his judgment, that he might have imagined or exaggerated the safety violations. He didn't imagine anything. It's all documented. I know, but this is what they do. They don't have to prove you're lying. They just have to make a jury doubt you're telling the whole truth. Wednesday night, Nolan drove to his father's house for the first time in 3 years. Bernard lived in a small ranch on the east side of town, the kind of place union wages had made possible in the 70s. The lawn needed mowing, the gutters needed cleaning, but the lights were on and smoke was coming from the chimney. Bernard answered the door in a flannel shirt and jeans worn soft from decades of washing. Figured you'd show up eventually. You okay? I'm fine. Pissed off, but fine. Bernard led him to the living room, where the notebook lay open on the coffee table. You see what they're saying about me? Yeah. The toolbox thing is horseshit. I can prove it if I can find that card. And the medical records, Bernard's jaw tightened. I had depression after your mother died. Took medication for a year, saw a therapist, got through it. That's not a secret, but they're making it sound like I'm unstable. They're trying to discredit you before you testify. I know what they're doing. Bernard sat heavily in an armchair that had probably been there since Nolan was a kid. Question is whether it's going to work. Nolan sat across from him. Jessica thinks we can fight it, get the records excluded, file complaints about the leak, establish that none of it affects the validity of your documentation. But Conrad's good at this. He's been burying inconvenient truths for 30 years. He knows how to make people doubt what they see with their own eyes. Bernard was quiet for a moment, staring at the notebook. You know what I keep thinking about? There was this kid on my assembly line in 2015, maybe 19, 20 years old. First real job out of high school, sweet kid, hard worker. His name was Danny Chen. Chen like Jessica Chen? Her cousin, actually. That's how I got connected with her firm in the first place. Bernard shook his head. Danny was doing quality checks on the VX 7-cylinder heads, kept flagging ones that didn't meet spec, told his supervisor the alloy was showing stress fractures. You know what happened? They fired him, transferred him to a different line, told him if he couldn't keep up with production quotas, maybe assembly work wasn't for him. Bernard's voice went quiet. He quit 3 months later. Last I heard, he was working at a Target in Ann Arbor. Smart kid, good eye for detail, exactly the kind of person we needed. And we pushed him out because he cared more about doing it right than doing it fast. Does Jessica know about him? She's trying to find him. If Danny will testify about the quality control issues, it corroborates both our stories, shows a pattern of Conrad silencing anyone who questioned the production timeline. Nolan looked at the notebook, at his father's handwriting documenting the same kind of willful blindness Nolan had encountered in the engineering department. What if they come after Danny too? Dig up his records, trash his reputation? They probably will. That's what Conrad does. He finds the thing you're ashamed of and puts it on display. Bernard met Nolan's eyes. But here's what I realized this week, watching them try to destroy me. I'm not ashamed. I had depression after my wife died. So what? Half the people in this town have had depression at some point. I kept detailed records of safety violations because I gave a damn about the cars we were building. And if Conrad wants to twist that into something ugly, let him try. The evidence speaks for itself, and evidence isn't always enough. Maybe not, but it's what we've got. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, a car drove past, headlights sweeping across the living room wall. The house settled with familiar creaks, the sounds of a place that had weathered decades and was still standing. "I'm sorry," Nolan said finally, "for the past 3 years. For not calling, not visiting, for... You don't need to apologize. We're both stubborn. We both said things we didn't mean. That's what happens." Bernard shifted in his chair. "But I'm glad you're here now." "Me too." Nolan drove home feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of it. Like maybe the stories Conrad was spinning could be countered with truth. Like maybe the documentation would be enough. That feeling lasted exactly until Thursday morning. At 6:47 a.m., Nolan's phone started ringing. Jessica Chen, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Turn on the news." Nolan fumbled for the TV remote. The local morning show was doing a segment about Vail Automotive, but instead of the bankruptcy proceedings or the safety recalls, they were focused on something else. The anchor was holding up a photograph. It showed Nolan and Maren Vail sitting in his garage office, her holding a stack of folders, both of them leaning close over the desk. Questions tonight about the relationship between Vail Automotive CEO Maren Vail and former company engineer Nolan Pierce. These photos, obtained by an anonymous source, show Vail and Pierce in what appears to be a private meeting at Pierce's auto shop. Sources close to the company suggest the two may have been coordinating their testimony against executive Conrad Sloan. The segment showed more photos. Maren arriving at the shop. Maren and Nolan talking in the bay. Maren's hand on his arm, a gesture that in context had been professional, but in the photos looked intimate. Corporate insiders are questioning whether Vail's support of Pierce's wrongful termination lawsuit represents a conflict of interest, and whether the relationship between the CEO and the key witness compromises the integrity of the federal investigation into Imashiti. Nolan turned it off. "When were these taken?" "Probably that first night she came to see you, or one of the times after." Jessica's voice was sharp. "Someone's been watching you, documenting your interactions, waiting for the right moment to release them." "Conrad." "Almost certainly. He's trying to make it look like you and Maren colluded to frame him, that your testimony isn't independent, that you're just doing her bidding." "That's insane. She came to me. I didn't even want to be involved in this." "I know, but the optics are bad, Nolan. CEO visits former employee late at night, hands him folders of documents. They have private meetings. It looks like coordination." "It was coordination. She was trying to figure out what I knew." "And that's fine. That's normal. But Conrad's spinning it as collusion. He's going to argue that you and Maren developed your testimony together, that your documentation isn't independent evidence, but rather a coordinated attack on his leadership." Nolan sat on the edge of his bed, the TV remote still in his hand. Elsie was asleep down the hall. The house was quiet, except for the distant sound of Torres's SUV idling outside. "What do we do?" "We fight it. We establish the timeline, that you had the documentation long before Maren ever contacted you. We get David Park to testify that the records are authentic, contemporaneous documents, not something you created in coordination with Maren. We..." Jessica stopped. "But Nolan, you need to understand. This changes things. The narrative was simple before. Loan mechanic documents, safety failures, gets vindicated when company collapses. Now it's more complicated. Now there are questions about motivations, relationships, hidden agendas. I don't have a hidden agenda. I know, but juries love conspiracy theories, and Conrad's giving them one." After Jessica hung up, Nolan sat in the pre-dawn darkness and tried to figure out how the truth had gotten so twisted. He'd kept records. He'd documented failures. He'd stayed quiet for 10 years because he was scared and trapped and trying to protect his daughter. And now he was the villain in a story about corporate corruption because he'd answered Maren Vail's questions honestly. His phone buzzed. Text from Maren. "I'm so sorry. I should have been more careful about being seen. This is my fault." Nolan didn't respond. What was there to say? It wasn't her fault. It was just Conrad being Conrad, finding the angle, exploiting the weakness, turning everything into a weapon. Another text. My board is calling for an emergency meeting. They want to know if I'm compromised, if my judgment about you is personal rather than professional. Is it? The text bubbles appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, I don't know. Nolan stared at those 3 words. Then he typed, focus on saving your company. I'll handle Conrad. How? Same way I've been handling him for 10 years. By documenting the truth and waiting for him to make a mistake. At 8 a.m., Nolan opened the shop. The news vans were back in force, cameras pointed at the bay doors. Marcus Webb had been joined by 2 additional security guards, corporate money finally taking the threat seriously. At 9:23, a black town car pulled up. The driver got out, walked to the bay, and handed Nolan an envelope. Inside was a check for $2 million and a single-page letter on expensive stationery. Mr. Pierce, this is a settlement offer. In exchange for your agreement to withdraw from all litigation against Vail Automotive Systems and to refrain from testifying in any related proceedings, we are prepared to offer the enclosed payment along with a full release from your non-disclosure agreement. This offer expires at 5 p.m. today. If you choose not to accept, we will proceed with all available legal remedies to protect the company's interests and reputation. The choice is yours. It was unsigned, but Nolan knew who it was from. He looked at the check. $2 million. More than he'd make in 20 years of running the shop. Enough to send Elsie to any college she wanted, to retire early, to never worry about money again. All he had to do was walk away. Marcus Webb was standing in the doorway. What is it? Settlement offer. How much? Enough. You gonna take it? Nolan thought about Bernard's notebook, about Danny Chen forced off the assembly line for caring too much about quality, about 743 engine failures and the families who'd lost people because Conrad Sloan had decided profit mattered more than safety. No, Nolan said. He tore the check in half, then in quarters, then into pieces small enough that they'd never be put back together. Call Jessica. Tell her Conrad just tried to buy me off. Make sure it goes in the record. Marcus almost smiled. You're either the bravest guy I've ever met or the dumbest. Probably both. At 11:15, Conrad Sloan himself showed up at the shop. He arrived in a Mercedes that was newer and more expensive than the one Marin drove, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Nolan's mortgage. He dismissed his driver and walked into the bay like he owned the place, which, technically, through the complicated web of Vail Automotive's corporate structure, he might have once upon a time. Mr. Pierce, he said, I assume you received my offer. Nolan didn't look up from the oil change he was doing. I received it. And your answer? No? Conrad walked closer. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd spent his life in rooms where his presence mattered, where people listened when he spoke. You're making a mistake. Probably not my first. $2 million, Mr. Pierce. That's generosity. That's me trying to resolve the situation amicably without destroying you in court. Destroying me? Nolan set down the oil filter and finally looked at Conrad. You already destroyed me, fired me, blacklisted me, forced me to sign an NDA that kept me quiet for a decade. What else you got? I have the resources to make your life very difficult. The photos of you and Marin are just the beginning. I have investigators looking into every aspect of your life, your finances, your relationships, your custody arrangement with your daughter. Nolan went very still. Don't. Don't what? Don't investigate the man who's trying to destroy my company? Don't protect the legacy I've spent 30 years building. Don't bring my daughter into this. Then take the money and walk away. Conrad's voice was calm, reasonable. Think about what's best for Elsie. $2 million could change her life. Good schools, college, opportunities you could never give her working in this. He gestured around the garage with barely concealed contempt. In this place. This place is honest work, which is more than I can say for what you do. Conrad smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Honest work. Is that what you call keeping records for 10 years so you could cash in when the company hit a crisis? I call it documenting evidence of corporate negligence that killed people. 700 deaths over 10 years, Mr. Pierce. across millions of vehicles. More people die from choking on hot dogs. It's tragic, yes, but it's also statistical noise. The cost of doing business in a world where perfect safety is impossible. Nolan felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. You really believe that? I believe in reality. I believe in making difficult decisions that keep companies alive and workers employed. You want to paint me as a villain? Fine. But I'm the villain who kept Vail Automotive running for 3 decades, who provided jobs for thousands of families, who built an empire that your precious documentation is now tearing apart. I'm not tearing it apart. You did that the moment you pushed defective engines into production. I made a business decision based on the information available at the time. You made a business decision to hide evidence and silence anyone who disagreed with you. Conrad's smile disappeared. Last chance, Mr. Pierce. Take the money. Walk away. Let me handle this mess the way it needs to be handled. No. Then you're a fool. Conrad turned to leave, then stopped at the bay door. I looked into your father's notebook. Very thorough, very detailed. Very convenient that he suddenly found it after 17 years. He didn't suddenly find it. He kept it, just like I kept mine. Or he created it recently based on your documentation to make your story look more credible. That's what my forensic analysts are going to testify. That Bernard Pierce fabricated evidence to support his son's lawsuit. You can't prove that. I don't have to prove it. I just have to make a jury doubt it. Conrad smiled again. You think you're the hero in this story, Mr. Pierce, the lone truth teller standing up to corporate corruption. But you're not. You're just a bitter ex-employee with an axe to grind and a father willing to lie for you. And by the time I'm done, that's the only story anyone will remember. He left. The Mercedes pulled away, and Nolan stood in the bay, hands shaking slightly, trying to convince himself that Conrad was wrong. At 2:47 p.m., Jessica called. Bernard's deposition is off. Conrad's lawyers filed a motion to exclude his testimony, arguing he's not competent to testify due to his history of mental illness. That's discrimination. Yes, and we'll fight it. But it's going to delay everything, which is exactly what Conrad wants. Time to keep attacking your credibility, time to make this story so complicated that the truth gets buried under competing narratives. What about Danny Chen? Did you find him? We found him. He's willing to testify, but he's scared. Conrad's people have already contacted him, implied there would be consequences if he gets involved. What kind of consequences? The vague kind that can't be prosecuted but are terrifying anyway. Jessica sighed. Nolan, I need to ask you something. The settlement offer, was it really $2 million? Yeah. And you turned it down? Yeah. Why? Nolan thought about how to answer that. About Elsie and college funds and the practical reasons he should have taken the money. About Bernard and Danny Chen and all the people who'd been silenced over the years. About 743 engine failures and the families who deserve to know the truth. Because some things matter more than money, he said finally. Jessica was quiet for a moment. Okay, then we fight, all of it. The photos, the competency hearing, the attacks on your credibility. We fight until we win or until there's nothing left to fight for. Which do you think it'll be? Honestly, I don't know, but I've never seen someone turn down $2 million on principle before. So maybe we've got a chance. That evening, Nolan picked up Elsie from school. She was quiet in the car, staring out the window at the street she'd grown up on. Dad? Yeah, Bug? Some kids at school said you're going to be on TV, like a real TV show, not just the news. Maybe. There's going to be a hearing. People want to watch it. Are you scared? Nolan thought about that. Yeah, a little. Mom used to say being scared means you care about something. Your mom was right about that. Do you care about beating the bad guy? I care about telling the truth. Sometimes that's the same thing as beating the bad guy. Sometimes it's not. Elsie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think you should tell the truth even if you don't beat him, because then at least you'll know you tried. When did you get so smart? I've always been smart. You just don't notice because you're usually thinking about engines. Nolan smiled. You're right. I'm sorry. It's okay. Engines are important too. They went home and made grilled cheese sandwiches, watched a show about Antarctica. Elsie fell asleep during the segment about leopard seals, and Nolan carried her to bed the way he'd done 1,000 times before. At 9:34 p.m., his phone rang. Unknown number, but he answered anyway. Mr. Pierce? A woman's voice, nervous, young. This is Sarah Winters. I'm a bookkeeper for Vail Automotive. Or I was. I quit 3 weeks ago. Okay. I have something you need to see. Something about Conrad Sloan and the VX7 recall. Can we meet? Nolan's instincts said this was a trap, but his instincts also said that Conrad was getting desperate, and desperate men made mistakes. Where? There's a FedEx on Miller Road. It's open until 10. I'll be in the parking lot. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He called Torres, who'd just switched out with the night shift guard, a guy named Patterson who was built like a refrigerator and had about as much personality. I need to go out. Can someone stay with Elsie? Patterson came inside without a word, settled into the living room recliner, and pulled out a paperback Western. Nolan grabbed his jacket and drove to the FedEx. Sarah Winters was exactly what her voice suggested. Mid-20s, scared, sitting in a 10-year-old Honda with the engine running like she might need to make a quick exit. She rolled down her window when Nolan pulled up next to her. Are you alone? Yeah. No recording devices? No lawyers? Just me. She handed him a manila envelope through the window. I found these 3 weeks ago, buried in Conrad's expense reports. He has a separate accounting system for certain transactions, cash payments that don't go through the normal channels. Nolan opened the envelope. Inside were copies of payment authorizations, all signed by Conrad Sloan. Cash disbursements ranging from $5,000 to $50,000, paid to various individuals and companies. And next to each payment, a notation in Conrad's handwriting. One entry caught Nolan's attention. March 2015, payment to Metallurgy Analysis Inc., $15,000. Final report on VX7 alloy composition. Suppress findings. He paid to bury a metallurgy report, Nolan said. That's not all. Look at the one from June 2015. Payment to N. Pierce. $25,000. Severance package. NDA enforcement critical. He paid extra to make sure my NDA stuck. And there are more. Payments to journalists, to former employees, to anyone who might have known about the defect. He's been covering this up for 10 years, paying people off, buying silence. Sarah's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't know what to do with this. If I went to the company's lawyers, they work for Conrad. If I went to the press, I'd be violating my own NDA. But then I saw your lawsuit and I thought, maybe you could use it. Why are you giving this to me? Because my sister died in a VX7 engine failure 2 years ago. Single car accident on I-94, engine seized, she lost control and hit a barrier. Sarah's voice cracked. She was 23 years old, and I've been working for the company that killed her, processing Conrad's expense reports, watching him hide evidence and pay off witnesses while pretending to care about safety. Nolan looked at the documents. This was it. This was the smoking gun. Proof that Conrad had known about the defect, had paid to suppress evidence, had systematically silenced anyone who threatened to expose the truth. I need to give these to my lawyer. I know, just don't say where you got them. I can't afford to lose my severance package. It's all I have left of my sister's estate, the wrongful death settlement. Vail settled with your family? $50,000 and an NDA. My parents signed it before I could stop them. They needed the money for my dad's medical bills. Sarah wiped her eyes. Everyone who knows the truth is being paid to stay quiet. That's how Conrad survived this long. He doesn't fight the evidence. He just buys everyone who has it. Not everyone. Sarah looked at him. No, not you. That's why I'm here. She drove away, taillights disappearing into the night. Nolan sat in the FedEx parking lot, holding an envelope full of evidence that would destroy Conrad Sloan, and felt the weight of it like a physical thing. He drove home and called Jessica. It was almost 10 p.m., but she answered immediately. I have Conrad's payment records, Nolan said. Proof he paid to suppress the metallurgy report. Proof he's been buying silence for 10 years. Everything. How did you get them? Someone gave them to me. Someone who can't be named. That's going to be a problem. We need to establish chain of custody. Prove they're authentic. They're authentic. I can feel it. These are Conrad's records. Feelings don't hold up in court, Nolan. We need... She stopped. Email them to me. I'll have David Park analyze them tonight. If they're real, if we can verify them, this changes everything. Nolan photographed every page and sent them over. Then he sat at his kitchen table and waited for the call that would tell him whether he'd finally found the evidence that Conrad couldn't explain away. The call came at 11:47 p.m. "They're real," Jessica said. David verified the signatures, cross-referenced the payment dates with Conrad's known schedule, matched the handwriting to other documents we have. This is authentic documentation of a systematic cover-up spanning a decade. So we have him. We have him. The federal hearing is in 2 weeks. This evidence, combined with your documentation and Bernard's records, proves Conrad knew about the defect from the beginning and paid to hide it. He's done. Nolan felt something unfamiliar, not quite victory, but close to it. Relief, maybe. Or just the exhaustion of carrying a secret for so long and finally being able to set it down. What happens now? Now we prepare. Because Conrad's going to come at us with everything he has left. This is his last stand, and he knows it. After Jessica hung up, Nolan checked on Elsie. Still asleep, still peaceful, still living in a world where her father was just a mechanic who sometimes had to go to important meetings. He went to his own room and lay in the dark, listening to the house settle and Patterson's footsteps in the living room and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. In 2 weeks, he'd sit in a federal hearing room and present the evidence that would end Conrad Sloan's career. In 2 weeks, the truth he'd been carrying for 10 years would finally matter more than the lies Conrad had built his empire on. In 2 weeks, it would all be over. But tonight, Nolan just lay in the dark and thought about Sarah Winters crying in a parking lot, about her sister who'd died at 23, about all the people who'd been bought and silenced and buried under Conrad's carefully constructed narrative. And he thought about the envelope Sarah had handed him through the car window, shaking hands, passing evidence across the distance between grief and justice, hoping it would be enough. It had to be enough. Because if it wasn't, then Conrad was right. Truth didn't matter. Only money mattered. Only power mattered. Only the willingness to bury everything inconvenient and keep moving forward. Nolan closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. Outside, Patterson's shift ended and Torres took over. The night deepened. The streetlight flickered and held. And somewhere in Detroit, Conrad Sloan was probably making plans of his own, calculating one last desperate move, preparing for the fight that would decide whether empires fell or mechanics did. 2 weeks. It felt like forever, and no time at all. The 2 weeks passed like water through a broken engine. Too fast in some moments, agonizingly slow in others. Nolan worked on cars, answered Jessica's endless questions about timeline and documentation, and watched Elsie practice for her school play where she played a talking tree. Normal life continued around the edges of everything that was about to happen. On the Sunday before the hearing, Bernard came over for dinner. It was the first time he'd been to the house since Nolan's mother had died, and they both pretended not to notice how strange it felt to have him sitting at the kitchen table again. "You ready for Tuesday?" Bernard asked, pushing meatloaf around his plate the same way Elsie did when she wasn't really hungry. "No." "Good. If you were ready, I'd be worried you weren't taking it seriously." Elsie looked up from her own plate. "Are you going to be on TV too, Grandpa?" "Might be, Bug, if the judge lets me talk." "What are you going to say?" Bernard glanced at Nolan, then back at Elsie. "I'm going to tell the truth about what I saw at the car factory, about the engines that weren't made right. Because the bad guy told them to make them wrong? Something like that." "Good. Bad guys should get in trouble." Elsie said it with the absolute certainty of someone who still believed the world worked the way it was supposed to. After dinner, after Elsie went to bed, Bernard and Nolan sat on the back porch drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm. The November air had teeth in it now, winter starting to show itself. "I've been thinking," Bernard said, "about what Conrad said, about us making up evidence to support each other. We didn't make up anything." "I know, but what if the jury believes him? What if they look at us, father and son, both with grudges against Vail Automotive, and decide we're just two bitter men trying to burn down the company that wronged us? Then they're not paying attention to the evidence. Evidence can be interpreted a lot of ways. Conrad's good at making people see what he wants them to see." Bernard set down his coffee cup. "I'm just saying, be prepared for the possibility that we tell the truth and nobody believes us anyway." "You having second thoughts?" "No. But I'm 71 years old. I've lived long enough to know that doing the right thing doesn't always end the way you hope it does." Nolan watched the neighbor's cat stalk something in the yard, patient and focused. You remember when I was 16 and I got caught shoplifting that carburetor from O'Reilly's? Yeah, dumbest thing you ever did. You made me go back and apologize to the manager. Pay for it with money from my summer job. Face the consequences. That's what you're supposed to do when you screw up. You told me something that day. You said doing the right thing after you've done the wrong thing doesn't erase what happened. But it's still the only choice worth making. Nolan looked at his father. I've thought about that a lot over the past 10 years. About staying quiet when I should have spoken up. About choosing safety over truth because I was scared. You had good reasons to be scared. Reasons aren't the same as being right. You taught me that too. Nolan stood, picking up both coffee cups. Tuesday, I'm going to do the right thing. Even if it's 10 years too late. Even if nobody believes me. Because it's the only choice worth making. Bernard nodded slowly. Your mother would be proud of you. You already told me that. Doesn't make it less true. Monday morning, Jessica called at 6:15 a.m. Conrad filed an emergency motion. He's trying to get the hearing postponed, claiming he needs more time to prepare his defense. Nolan was already at the shop, had been since 5. Couldn't sleep, so he'd come in early and started an engine teardown that didn't need to be done for another week. Will the judge grant it? No. Conrad's had months to prepare. This is just a delaying tactic. Jessica paused. But there's something else. The motion included an affidavit from someone claiming you approached them last year trying to sell documentation about Vail Automotive. That's a lie. I know it's a lie. But it's a lie that's now in the court record, and Conrad's lawyers are going to use it to argue you've been trying to profit from this all along. Who's the someone? Name's redacted in the filing. We won't know until they potentially testify. Nolan gripped the phone tighter. He's making up witnesses now. Or he found someone willing to lie for money. Either way, we need to be ready for it. Jessica's voice softened slightly. Nolan, I need you to stay focused tomorrow. Don't let Conrad get under your skin. Don't let him make you angry. Just present the facts and let the evidence speak. What if the evidence isn't enough? Then we appeal. But I don't think it'll come to that. The payment records from Sarah Winters, your documentation, Bernard's notebook, it's overwhelming. Conrad can spin all the narratives he wants, but he can't explain away his own handwriting authorizing payments to suppress evidence. After Jessica hung up, Nolan stood in the garage and looked at the partially disassembled engine in front of him. A 2019 VX7, brought in for routine maintenance, nothing wrong with it except normal wear. The cylinder heads showed no signs of the stress fractures that had plagued the earlier models. Somewhere around 2018, Vail had quietly changed the alloy composition, fixed the defect without ever admitting there had been one. 743 failures before they'd bothered to get it right. Marcus Webb came in around 8, carrying coffee and looking like he hadn't slept much either. Big day tomorrow, he said. Yeah. You know, I've done security for a lot of people. CEOs, politicians, people who thought they were important, but I've never done security for someone who turned down $2 million on principle. Probably because most people are smarter than me. Or most people don't actually believe in anything. Marcus handed him the coffee. For what it's worth, I think you're going to do fine tomorrow. You've got the truth on your side. Truth didn't help me much 10 years ago. 10 years ago, you were alone. Tomorrow, you've got lawyers, evidence, witnesses, and a federal judge who's apparently really tired of Conrad Sloan's legal maneuvering. Marcus smiled slightly. Plus, you've got me and Torres making sure nobody tries anything stupid. You think Conrad would try something? I think desperate men do desperate things. And Conrad's about as desperate as they come. The rest of Monday passed in a blur of preparation. Jessica called 3 more times with updates, questions, warnings about what Conrad's lawyers might try. Marin sent a text that just said, "Good luck tomorrow. The truth matters." Nolan didn't respond, wasn't sure what he'd say if he did. That evening, he took Elsie to her favorite diner, the one with the jukebox that still played actual records, and the waitress who always gave her extra whipped cream on her hot chocolate. Big day tomorrow, huh? Elsie said, spinning on the counter stool the way she always did despite Nolan telling her to stop. Yeah, Bug, big day. Are you going to win? I'm going to tell the truth. Sometimes that's the same as winning, sometimes it's not. Mom says you always have to tell the truth even when it's hard. Your mom's right about that. Elsie took a sip of her hot chocolate, getting whipped cream on her nose. What happens if the bad guy wins? Nolan thought about how to answer that. Then we tried our best and it wasn't enough. But at least we tried. That seems sad. Yeah, it is, but trying matters, even when you lose. I think you're going to win, Elsie said with complete confidence, because you're the goodest person I know. Goodest isn't a word. It should be. They went home. Elsie brushed her teeth and put on pajamas and climbed into bed with her elephant. Nolan read her 2 chapters of the book about the mouse in the department store, and she fell asleep halfway through a sentence about a stuffed giraffe. Nolan sat in her doorway for a long time, watching her sleep, thinking about all the things he'd done to protect her and all the things he couldn't protect her from. Tomorrow, he'd stand in a federal hearing room and tell a story that might make her proud or might make her the kid whose dad tried to take down a car company and failed. Either way, the story would be told, and they'd have to live with whatever came after. At 10:47 p.m., his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Pierce, Conrad Sloane's voice, tired and older than it had sounded in the conference room. I want to make you one final offer. No. You haven't heard it yet. Don't need to. The answer's no. $5 million. Complete release from your NDA. A public statement from Vail Automotive acknowledging your contributions to the VX7 design and apologizing for your wrongful termination. Your name goes back on the patent. Everything you asked for. Nolan was quiet. It was everything he'd wanted. Everything he'd told Marin he needed as the price for his testimony. But coming from Conrad, it felt like poison disguised as food. What's the catch? You withdraw from the hearing. You don't testify. You let Vail Automotive handle this situation internally without federal intervention. So you can bury it again. So we can address the safety issues properly, compensate the affected families appropriately, and rebuild the company without destroying everything my family built over 70 years. Your family built a good company. You turned it into something that valued profit over people. Conrad was silent for a moment. I'm 73 years old, Mr. Pierce. I've given my entire life to Vail Automotive. Every decision I made to keep the company alive, to keep people employed, to honor the legacy my father and grandfather built. Were some of those decisions wrong in hindsight? Yes. But they were made with the best information available at the time, under pressure that you can't begin to understand. You paid to suppress a metallurgy report that proved the alloy was defective. I made a business judgment that the benefits of meeting our contract obligations outweighed the theoretical risks identified in one report that contradicted 3 others. People died, Conrad. People die in car accidents every day. Most of them have nothing to do with manufacturing defects. You can't prove that every VX7 failure was caused by the alloy issue. You can't prove that fixing it earlier would have saved all those lives. You're making assumptions and calling them facts. Nolan felt something cold settle in his chest. You actually believe that. You actually think you did nothing wrong. I think I made difficult decisions in impossible situations. And I think you're about to destroy a company that employs 14,000 people because you're angry about what happened to your career. Conrad's voice hardened. Take the $5 million. Put your name back on the patent. Walk away knowing you got justice. Because if you go through with this hearing, I will destroy you. I will bring witnesses who will testify you tried to sell corporate secrets. I will expose every mistake you've ever made, every financial problem, every personal failure. I will make sure the only thing people remember about you is that you were a bitter, vindictive ex-employee who destroyed thousands of jobs because you couldn't let go of a grudge. You done? Think about your daughter, Mr. Pierce. Think about what kind of life $5 million could give her. Think about whether your pride is worth more than her future. Nolan hung up. Then he blocked the number, turned off his phone, and sat in the dark kitchen trying to stop his hands from shaking. $5 million. His name on the patent. Everything he'd wanted. And all he had to do was let Conrad Sloane walk away from killing 743 people through negligence and greed. He thought about Elsie sleeping down the hall, about the life that kind of money could buy her, college without debt, opportunities without limits, everything he'd never been able to give her on a mechanic's salary. He thought about Sarah Winters crying in a parking lot, about her sister dead at 23, about all the families who'd gotten settlement checks and NDAs instead of truth. He thought about Bernard's notebook and Danny Chen pushed off the assembly line and 10 years of engines failing exactly the way Nolan had predicted they would. Then he got up, checked the locks on the doors, looked in on Elsie one more time, and went to bed knowing he'd made his choice a long time ago. The only question had been whether he'd have the courage to follow through. Tuesday morning came gray and cold, the kind of November day that promised winter was coming whether you were ready or not. Nolan put on the blue shirt Jessica had told him to wear, the one without grease stains, and drove to Detroit with Bernard in the passenger seat and Marcus Webb following in the SUV behind them. They didn't talk much. Bernard dozed off somewhere around the Ohio-Michigan border, and Nolan was left alone with the road and his thoughts and the weight of what he was about to do. The federal building in Detroit was all granite and glass, imposing in the way government buildings were supposed to be. Security took 20 minutes. Metal detectors, bag searches, the casual indignity of being treated like a potential threat. Jessica met them inside, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Nolan's car, and carrying a briefcase that looked heavy enough to need its own security clearance. "Conrad's already here," she said, "with his full legal team, and Marin's here too, though she's not testifying. She just wanted to be present." "How is she?" "Nervous. Her board is watching this hearing closely. If things go badly for Conrad, they'll remove him and probably replace him with her permanently. If things go well for him..." Jessica didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what happened if Conrad survived this. The hearing room was smaller than Nolan expected, more like a large conference room than a courtroom. The judge, a woman in her 50s named Margaret Chu, who had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense, sat at the front behind a bench that looked like it had been there since the building was built. Conrad was at one table with 3 lawyers. Jessica guided Nolan and Bernard to the other table, where David Park was already set up with a laptop and enough binders to build a small fort. Marin sat in the gallery behind them. When Nolan glanced back, she gave him a small nod that might have been encouragement or might have been apology. He couldn't tell. Judge Chu called the hearing to order at 9 a.m. exactly. "This is a preliminary hearing to determine whether there's sufficient evidence to refer this matter to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation," she said, looking over reading glasses at everyone in the room. "I've reviewed the filings from both sides. Mr. Pierce, your counsel will present evidence first." Jessica stood. "Thank you, Your Honor. We'll be presenting documentation showing that Vail Automotive Systems, under the direction of Conrad Sloan, knowingly concealed a dangerous defect in the VX7 engine platform, suppressed evidence of that defect, and systematically silenced employees who attempted to report safety concerns." She walked Nolan through his testimony calmly, methodically. "When did you first identify the defect? What warnings did you issue? How did the company respond? What documentation did you keep?" "The facts, just the facts, nothing that could be twisted." Nolan answered in the same flat tone he'd used in the deposition. He'd spent 10 years practicing how to tell this story without emotion, and the practice showed. Then Jessica introduced Bernard's notebook. Bernard testified about the manufacturing shortcuts, the accelerated production timeline, the quality control violations. His voice shook slightly, but the evidence was solid. Finally, Jessica presented the payment records from Sarah Professor Winters. Conrad's handwriting, Conrad's signature. $15,000 to suppress a metallurgy report. $25,000 to enforce Nolan's NDA. Payment after payment, silencing witness after witness. "Your Honor," Jessica said, "this is not a case of honest business disagreement. This is systematic corporate misconduct resulting in at least 743 documented deaths. Mr. Sloan had evidence of a lethal defect and chose to hide it rather than fix it." Judge Chu looked at the documents in front of her, then at Conrad. "Mr. Sloan, you'll have your opportunity to respond, but I have to say these payment records are concerning." Conrad's lead attorney stood. "Your Honor, we dispute the authenticity of those records. They were provided by an anonymous source with no chain of custody. We have no way to verify they're genuine." "The handwriting analysis," Jessica started, "is based on documents that could have been forged. We have our own handwriting expert who will testify that the signatures are inconsistent with Mr. Sloan's known writing samples." Judge Chu made a note. "We'll hear from both experts. Mr. Sloan, do you wish to testify?" Conrad stood. He looked older than he had in the deposition, more tired, but his voice was still strong when he spoke. "Your Honor, I've spent 43 years at Vale Automotive. I've made thousands of decisions, many of them difficult, all of them with the company's best interests and the welfare of our employees in mind. Mr. Pierce was a talented engineer who made valuable contributions to the VX7 design. But he was also inflexible, unable to accept that engineering is about balancing competing priorities: safety, cost, timeline, manufacturability. When we couldn't meet every specification he insisted on, he took it personally. And when we had to let him go for performance issues, he began a decade-long campaign to destroy the company that had given him his start. Nolan started to stand, but Jessica put a hand on his arm. Wait. The payment records Ms. Chen presented, Conrad continued, are sophisticated forgeries created to support Mr. Pierce's narrative. I never paid to suppress evidence. I never authorized payments to silence employees. These documents are fabrications, and we will prove that conclusively. Judge Chu looked at the payment records, then at Conrad. Mr. Sloan, setting aside the authenticity question for a moment, are you denying that you had any knowledge of the VX7 defect prior to the recent recalls? I'm saying that we had reports of potential issues, as we do with every engine platform. Some engineers thought the alloy composition needed adjustment. Others believed it was within acceptable parameters. We ran additional tests, consulted external experts, and made a judgment call based on the best available data. And the accelerated production timeline was necessary to meet contractual obligations. We had committed to delivery dates. Failing to meet those dates would have cost us hundreds of millions in penalties and potentially bankrupted the company. So you chose to meet the timeline rather than address the safety concerns. We chose to proceed with production while continuing to monitor and test. It was a calculated risk based on incomplete data. In hindsight, we should have delayed production, but at the time, with the information we had, it seemed like the right decision. Judge Chu was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mr. Sloan, I've been a judge for 22 years. I've heard a lot of testimony from a lot of people trying to justify questionable decisions. And I have to say you're very good at making negligence sound like reasonable business judgment. Your Honor, I'm simply explaining, I know what you're explaining, and if this were just a business dispute, your explanation might be sufficient, but we're talking about hundreds of deaths, and the payment records, authentic or not, suggest a pattern of concealment that goes well beyond honest disagreement about engineering priorities. Conrad's attorney stood again. Your Honor, we'd like to call a witness who can speak to Mr. Pierce's credibility and motivations. Who's the witness? Michael Torres. He's a private investigator who was hired by Mr. Pierce last year to— Objection, Jessica said sharply. We've had no notice of this witness. His name doesn't appear anywhere in the defendant's filings. We disclosed him in Monday's emergency motion, which was filed less than 48 hours ago in violation of discovery rules. Judge Chu held up a hand. Enough. Mr. Torres, are you present? A man stood from the gallery. Nolan recognized him, not Torres, the security guard, but someone else, someone he'd never seen before. Yes, Your Honor. When did Mr. Sloan's counsel first contact you about testifying? Torres hesitated. Sunday evening. And what is your testimony going to be? That Mr. Pierce approached me in April of last year, asking me to investigate Vale Automotive's safety records. He offered me $10,000 to find evidence of corporate misconduct that he could use in a lawsuit. Nolan felt the room tilt. That's not true. Jessica gripped his arm harder. Your Honor, this is clearly a fabricated witness produced at the last minute to— I have emails, Torres said. Communications from an address registered to Mr. Pierce's auto shop. Detailed discussions about what evidence I should look for and how much he was willing to pay. Your Honor, we'd like time to examine these alleged emails, Jessica said, to verify their authenticity, to determine if they've been tampered with. Yeah, of course you would, Conrad's attorney said smoothly. Just as we'd like time to verify the payment records you presented. But if we're going to question the authenticity of evidence, we should question all of it. Judge Chu looked frustrated. This is exactly the kind of last-minute gamesmanship I was hoping to avoid. Mr. Torres, do you have these emails with you? Yes, Your Honor. Provide them to Ms. Chen's team for immediate review. We'll take a 30-minute recess. The hearing broke. Jessica pulled Nolan and David Park into a small conference room down the hall. Did you hire an investigator last year? She asked. No, I've never seen that guy before in my life. Then someone created fake emails to make it look like you did. David was already on his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. If I can get access to the originals, I can check the metadata, verify whether they're legitimate or fabricated. Jessica's phone buzzed. She looked at it, and her expression changed. It's Sarah Winters. She says Conrad's people found out she gave us the payment records. They're threatening to sue her for theft of company property and violation of her NDA. Can they do that? They can try, and even if they lose, the legal fees could bankrupt her. Jessica looked at Nolan. She's scared. She's saying she might have to recant, claim the documents were altered, protect herself. Without Sarah's testimony, we can't establish where the payment records came from, David said quietly. Conrad's lawyers will argue they're forgeries with no provenance. Nolan stood and walked to the window. 30 floors below, Detroit sprawled out in all its complicated glory, a city that had built itself on making things, that had collapsed when it forgot how to make them right, that was slowly rebuilding itself into something new. We're going to lose, he said. We don't know that. Yes, we do. Conrad's good at this. He's had 30 years to perfect the art of making truth look like lies and lies look like truth. He'll discredit Sarah, discredit the payment records, put his fake investigator on the stand to make me look like a con artist. And in the end, it'll be my word against his. Former employee with a grudge versus respected executive with a lifetime of service. Jessica was quiet, because she knew he was right. Nolan turned back from the window. Unless we have something Conrad can't explain away, something he can't spin or discredit or hide. Like what? Like the original metallurgy report, the one Conrad paid to suppress. If we could find that, if we could show what it actually said, it's gone, Nolan. Conrad's been covering his tracks for 10 years. That report doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it does, Bernard said from the doorway. He'd been sitting quietly in the corner, but now he stood. Maybe I know someone who might have kept a copy. Who? Danny Chen. When he was working quality control, he used to make copies of reports before they went up the chain. Said he didn't trust management not to make them disappear. If he copied the metallurgy report, Jessica was already dialing. What's his number? Don't have it, but his cousin might. Bernard pulled out his phone. 10 minutes later, Jessica was on the phone with Danny Chen. 3 minutes after that, she was arranging a courier to pick up a file from Danny's apartment in Ann Arbor and rush it to Detroit. He kept everything, she said, hanging up. Every report he ever copied. He's got the original metallurgy analysis from March 2015, before Conrad buried it. Can we get it here before the hearing resumes? Danny's meeting the courier at his apartment now. It's a 90-minute drive in good traffic. We might be able to stall until... Judge Chu's clerk appeared in the doorway. Ms. Chen, the judge is ready to resume. They filed back into the hearing room. Conrad looked confident, his lawyers relaxed. They thought they'd won. They thought the fake investigator and the threatened witness and the questions about authenticity had been enough to muddy the waters. Judge Chu settled behind the bench. Ms. Chen, have you had time to review Mr. Torres's emails? We have, Your Honor. They're forgeries. The metadata shows they were created Sunday night, not last April. The IP address traces to a server in Virginia commonly used for creating fake communications, and the writing style doesn't match any actual correspondence from my client. Conrad's attorney stood. Your Honor, we dispute... Save it, Judge Chu said. I've seen this kind of fabricated evidence before. Mr. Torres, you're excused, and you should know that lying to a federal judge is a crime. I'm referring your testimony to the U.S. Attorney's Office for investigation. Torres went pale and practically ran from the room. Judge Chu looked at Conrad. Mr. Sloan, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you or did you not authorize the creation of false evidence to discredit Mr. Pierce? Your Honor, I have no knowledge of... That's not what I asked. Did you or did you not direct your attorneys to produce a fake witness? Conrad hesitated just for a second. And in that second, Nolan saw it. The calculation, the weighing of options, the decision about what lie he could get away with. I may have suggested that we investigate whether Mr. Pierce had hired private investigators. What my attorneys did with that suggestion is your responsibility, Judge Chu said. You're the client. They work for you. And suborning perjury is a federal crime, Mr. Sloan. The room went very quiet. Then Jessica's phone buzzed. She looked at it, and something in her expression changed. Your Honor, we have new evidence we'd like to introduce. It just arrived from Ann Arbor. What kind of evidence? The original metallurgy report on the VX7 alloy composition, the one Mr. Sloan paid to suppress in March 2015. Conrad's face went gray. His attorney started to object, but Jessica was already handing copies to the clerk, to the judge, to Conrad's legal team. Judge Chu read in silence for a long moment. Then she looked up at Conrad. According to this report, the alloy composition used in the VX7 cylinder heads was definitively unsuitable for the stated thermal load parameters and presented an unacceptable risk of catastrophic failure under sustained high heat conditions. The report recommended immediate cessation of production pending redesign. She set down the document. Mr. Sloan, you received this report in March 2015. Mr. Pierce filed his internal warnings in the same month, and instead of halting production, you paid the metallurgy firm $15,000 to suppress their findings and push the VX7 into production anyway. Is that accurate? Conrad didn't answer. Mr. Sloan, I'm asking you a direct question. We had other reports that contradicted. Show me one. Judge Chu's voice was hard. Show me one report from a qualified metallurgist that said this alloy composition was safe. Silence. You can't, can you? Because there isn't one. You had multiple warnings from multiple sources, all telling you the same thing. The VX7 was dangerous. And you buried every single one of them because stopping production would have cost you money. Conrad stood, his hands shaking slightly. Your Honor, I made a business decision based on greed. Judge Chu closed the folder in front of her. 743 people died because you valued profit over safety. And then you spent 10 years covering it up, paying off witnesses, silencing employees, and destroying the careers of anyone who threatened to expose the truth. She looked at Nolan. Mr. Pierce, I owe you an apology. The system failed you 10 years ago when Vail Automotive fired you for doing your job. And it's failed every family that lost someone to a defective engine that should never have made it into production. I can't fix that, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. Judge Chu turned back to Conrad. I'm referring this matter to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation. The charges will likely include criminal negligence, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to conceal evidence. Additionally, I'm imposing sanctions on your legal team for attempting to introduce fabricated evidence, and I'm forwarding the matter to the state bar for disciplinary proceedings. Conrad sat down heavily. This hearing is concluded, Judge Chu said. Mr. Pierce Sr., thank you for your testimony and your documentation. The courage it takes to stand up to a company with this many resources. She paused. Well, the truth matters, even when it takes 10 years to come out. The hearing ended. People stood, gathered papers, filed out. Nolan sat at the table, feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not victory, exactly. Not satisfaction. Just exhaustion. And maybe relief. Marin approached their table. She looked at Nolan, then at the metallurgy report still sitting in front of Judge Chu. I'm sorry, she said quietly, for what Conrad did, for what the company did, for all of it. You weren't there. I'm here now, and I'm going to make sure this never happens again. She handed him an envelope. This is from the board. They voted this morning to remove Conrad and appoint me as permanent CEO. And this, she gestured to the envelope. This is what you asked for. Your name goes back on the VX7 patent, the original design, before Conrad's changes. It's not enough, I know, but it's what I can give you. Nolan opened the envelope. Inside was a legal document, heavy paper, official seals, the kind of document that looked important because it was. Patent amendment and attribution correction, listing Nolan Pierce as primary design engineer on the VX7 engine platform, acknowledging his contributions, restoring what had been taken. Thank you, he said. Marin nodded. Then she left, and it was just Nolan and Bernard and Jessica gathering files and preparing to leave a building where the truth had finally been told. Outside, the November sky had cleared slightly, weak sunlight breaking through the clouds. News vans surrounded the building, not the local affiliates anymore, but national networks. The story had grown beyond Grayford, beyond Detroit, beyond one mechanic and one executive. It was a story about what happened when profit mattered more than people, and what it cost to finally tell the truth. Jessica fielded questions from reporters while Nolan and Bernard walked to the car. Marcus Webb followed at a discreet distance, still on duty even though the danger had probably passed. "You did good in there," Bernard said as they drove back toward Ohio. "We both did. Your mother would be proud." "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." They drove in silence for a while, the Detroit skyline disappearing in the rearview mirror. "What happens now?" Bernard asked. "Conrad goes to trial. The families get real compensation instead of hush money. Vale Automotive either rebuilds itself into something better, or it doesn't." Nolan glanced at his father. "And I go back to fixing cars." "That's it? After all this, you just go back to your garage. It's a good garage, honest work. Elsie's school is 3 blocks away. Our life is there. You could do more. Consult for other companies, work as an expert witness, write a book about what happened." "I could, but I won't." Nolan merged onto the highway heading south. "I spent 10 years keeping records because I knew this day would come. And now it's here, and it's done. I told the truth. Conrad's going to face consequences. That's enough." Bernard was quiet for a moment. "I used to think you were too much like me. Stubborn, single-minded, unwilling to let things go. But you're not like me. You're better. You knew when to fight and when to walk away. I learned from watching you fight for 32 years and end up fired and bitter." Ouch. "You asked." They stopped for gas somewhere around Toledo. While Bernard went inside for coffee, Nolan called Elsie. "Dad, did you win?" "Yeah, Bug, we won." I told you the goodest person would win." "You were right. Is the bad guy going to jail?" "Probably. Eventually. These things take time." "Good. Bad guys should go to jail." Then quieter. "Are you coming home?" "I'm on my way right now. Be there in time for dinner. Can we have tacos?" "We can have whatever you want." After he hung up, Nolan stood next to the car and watched traffic flow past on the highway. All these people going somewhere, living their lives, not knowing or caring that a federal judge in Detroit had just referred a corporate executive for criminal prosecution. The world was big and mostly indifferent, and the truth mattered less than you wanted it to, but more than you feared it might. Bernard came back with terrible gas station coffee and a candy bar he didn't need. "Ready to go home?" "Yeah," Nolan said. "Let's go home." They pulled into Grayford just after 6. The news vans were gone. They'd followed the story to Detroit and would stay there for the trial, for the appeals, for whatever came next. Oak Street looked the way it always had. Quiet, ordinary. The kind of place where nothing important ever happened. Except something important had happened. A mechanic in a 2-bay garage had documented the truth for 10 years, and when the moment came, he'd been brave enough to tell it. Elsie ran out of Mrs. Patterson's house when Nolan pulled up, practically tackling him with a hug that knocked him back a step. "You're famous. You're on TV and everything." "I'm not famous. I'm just your dad. You're my dad who beat the bad guy." "We beat the bad guy," Nolan corrected, gesturing to Bernard. "Me and Grandpa together." "Then you're both heroes." They went inside, made tacos with too much cheese and not enough lettuce, exactly the way Elsie liked them, watched a nature documentary about penguins. Bernard fell asleep on the couch during the segment about predators, and Elsie curled up next to him, her small hand resting on his arm. Nolan sat in the kitchen and looked at the patent document Marin had given him. His name, printed in official typeface. Recognition of what he'd done before everything went wrong. It wasn't justice. Justice would be those 743 people still alive. But it was something. An acknowledgement. A correction of the record. His phone buzzed. Text from Jessica. DOJ confirmed they're opening a criminal investigation. Conrad's looking at 10 to 15 years if convicted. You did it. Another text from Sarah Winters. Thank you. My sister would be proud. Another from Danny Chen. Glad the report helped. Glad I kept it. And one from Marin. The board approved a compensation fund for the families. Real money, no ND. As required. It's not enough, but it's a start. Nolan turned off his phone and sat in the quiet kitchen, listening to the house settle and Elsie's soft breathing from the living room and Bernard's gentle snoring. He'd spent 10 years waiting for this moment, 10 years documenting, recording, preserving evidence that a defect existed and people had known and nobody had cared enough to stop it. And now the moment was here, and it felt smaller than he'd expected, less triumphant, more like the end of a long shift where you'd fixed what you could and accepted what you couldn't. The next morning, Nolan opened the shop at 8 like he always did. There was a Subaru waiting for an oil change and a Ford that needed new tires, and a Dodge with a mysterious rattle that would probably turn out to be something simple and stupid. Normal work. Honest work. The kind of thing that didn't make the news but kept the world running anyway. Around 10, a young woman came in with a Honda Civic that was making a clicking noise. Nolan listened to the engine, heard the timing, recognized the pattern. VX7 engine? He asked. Yeah, is that bad? Depends. What year? 2016. Nolan felt something familiar settle in his chest. I need to check something. It'll take about an hour. He pulled the cylinder head and examined the alloy composition, looking for the stress fractures he'd seen so many times before. But the metal was clean, properly heat-treated. No signs of the defect that had plagued the earlier models. You're fine, he told her. This is one of the fixed models. The clicking is just your valve adjustment. I can fix it in 20 minutes. Are you the guy from the news, the one who sued Vail Automotive? I'm a mechanic, but yeah, that was me. My brother died in a VX7 engine failure 3 years ago. She said it matter-of-factly, like she'd said it so many times the emotion had worn smooth. Insurance company ruled it driver error. Our family got nothing. I'm sorry. Is Vail going to pay us now? Now that everyone knows the truth? They're setting up a compensation fund. You should call this number. He wrote down Jessica Chen's office number on a shop rag. Tell her what happened. She'll help you. The woman took the number, looking at it like it might disappear. Thank you for what you did, for making them admit it. After she left, Nolan stood in the bay and thought about all the people he'd never meet who'd been affected by Conrad's decisions. All the families who'd lost someone and been told it was their fault, their bad luck, their failure to maintain the vehicle properly. All the people who'd never know that someone had tried to warn the company and been silenced for it. The truth was out now. It wouldn't bring anyone back, wouldn't undo the damage, but it would at least let people know it wasn't their fault. That had to count for something. Marcus Webb came by around noon, no longer on duty, but apparently in the habit of checking in. You okay? He asked. Yeah, just thinking. About? About how telling the truth doesn't fix anything. It just lets people know what really happened, and sometimes that's enough, and sometimes it's not. Marcus leaned against the workbench. You know what I learned doing security? Most people aren't looking for justice. They're just looking for someone to acknowledge that what happened to them mattered, that it wasn't random, wasn't their fault, wasn't meaningless. You think that's enough? I think it's what we've got. That afternoon, Nolan picked up Elsie from school. She climbed into the car and immediately started talking about her day, about the spelling test she'd aced and the boy who'd thrown up in the cafeteria and the art project that was due Friday. Mrs. Patterson says you're a hero, Elsie said. Mrs. Patterson says a lot of things. Are you, though? A hero? Nolan thought about how to answer that. I did what I thought was right. Took me a long time to find the courage to do it, but I did it eventually. I don't know if that makes me a hero. What does it make you? Someone who finally stopped being scared. Elsie considered this. I think that's the same thing. They went home. Made spaghetti with sauce from a jar. Watched Elsie practice her lines for the school play where she played a talking tree. Normal evening things. Ordinary life. At bedtime, Elsie looked up at Nolan from her pillow. Dad, are you glad you told the truth? Even though it was hard? Yeah, Bug, I am. Even though it took 10 years? Even though it took 10 years. Good, because Mrs. Patterson says it's never too late to do the right thing. Mrs. Patterson's right about that. Elsie rolled over, hugging her elephant. I'm glad you're not a regular mechanic anymore. I'm glad you're a hero mechanic. I'm still just a mechanic, Bug. Nope, you're a hero mechanic. I decided. Nolan smiled and turned off the light. Later, sitting on the back porch with coffee that had gone cold, Nolan looked out at the yard and thought about everything that had happened. About Conrad Sloan facing criminal charges. About Vail Automotive trying to rebuild itself under Marin's leadership. about the compensation fund and the patent correction and all the ways the system had finally, barely, creakingly acknowledged that something wrong had happened. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete. People were still dead. Families were still broken. Years had been lost that couldn't be recovered. But the truth was out there now, in court records and news reports and federal investigations. And maybe that mattered. Maybe truth had its own kind of power, even when it came too late to prevent the damage it documented. Nolan's phone buzzed one last time. Text from Bernard. Your mother used to say that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it just feels necessary. I think she'd be proud we finally figured that out. Nolan typed back, Thanks, Dad, for everything. Then he turned off his phone and sat in the darkness of his backyard in Grayford, Ohio, where he was still just a mechanic who ran a small shop and raised his daughter alone and sometimes fixed the broken things that other people had given up on. The difference was, now people knew his name, knew the story, knew that sometimes one person with a filing cabinet full of evidence and the courage to finally use it could make the powerful answer for what they'd done. It was a small victory in a world that needed bigger ones, but small victories added up. And maybe that's all anyone could really do. Fix what they could fix, document what they couldn't, and hope that someday someone would care enough to listen. The streetlight on the corner flickered and held, casting its steady glow over a neighborhood that looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, but was somehow different. Because truth had been told here. Justice had started here. And a mechanic in a two-bay garage had proven that ordinary people could stand up to extraordinary corruption and occasionally, just occasionally, win. Nolan finished his cold coffee and went inside to a house full of the quiet sounds of a life well lived. His daughter breathing softly in sleep, the refrigerator humming, the heat clicking on against the November cold. Tomorrow, he'd open the shop and fix cars and be the same person he'd always been, just with a story now that people would remember. Tonight, he just sat in the kitchen where he'd made 1,000 meals and held a patent document that finally had his name on it, and thought about how sometimes doing the right thing doesn't change everything, but it changes enough. And enough, Nolan had learned, was all you could really ask for.